financially stable, and expecting. Oh, and did I mention I'm totally ready for parenthood. What I knew I couldn't be at 18, I was at 25 and again at 28. And let me tell you, there is a huge difference between accidentally getting knocked up and consciously making a baby. My children were brought into this little plane of existence with more love and desire than some people ever receive in a lifetime, and they deserve it. Everyone deserves this. Oftentimes, I look at my kids and get overwhelmed with the thought that I would not have been the most excellent parent that I am today without the critical family planning choices I made as a teen. I am able to raise my children clearly and thoughtfully, not in a cloud of teenage drama and angst. I'm wholeheartedly thankful for this, and I'm so looking forward to the people they become. At age 18, most kids believe they are invincible. But what some kids don't realize is that life can simply change in the blink of an eye. I wasn't ready for a baby, nor was my boyfriend of only 2 months. My biggest issue was that my mother was fully against abortion and ruled it out for me immediately. He and I talked it over, and I broke the news to my mother that I could not keep the baby, not only because I wasn't ready, but also because I didn't want to lose everything I had worked so hard to get. She stopped talking to me, and my boyfriend became my rock. When my appointment finally came, I found out what it was like to be protested against. Something no one should ever have to feel when they are doing something that isn't wrong. The crude things that came from these people's mouths did not make them right, or just as they screamed about how what I was doing was wrong and against faith. I'm not strong about faith entirely, but if they wanted to speak of sinning, then I fully agree their current actions were just as bad of a sin as mine. The doctor did his job, and everyone involved was helpful and kind and understood that this situation was no easy choice made in only a few days. Though my story seems common from what many others have also told, I just want to make it clear to every young girl in this situation that you are not alone. There is always going to be someone just like you with the same, if not worse, situation, and always there will be one there to help. So though those protesters make everyone a bit uneasy, I just want to reassure the girls who know this choice is right for them, not to be afraid. You are not wrong in whatever you choose to do. You are only told you're wrong because people are too uneducated to understand. I hope my story helps at least one person, and don't forget that you are loved. I will continue to read another story. When I first told him about the pregnancy, he told me that he supported me no matter what. Turns out those were just empty words. I was alone in that cold room, despite the fact that he said he would take me. The room wasn't that bad, and the doctors and nurses were very wonderful and nice. But I didn't have anyone I really knew by my side. That's the only part that I regret. That I would be with a boy who would leave me alone in that room. I do not regret my choice. I never have. Because I love her with all of my being, even now. She was only 10 weeks old, but I knew that with all of my being, it was female. And I knew her name was Maria, even though I've never told anyone that. But I love her enough to know that it was the best decision for her. And that's okay.
I'd like to inquire of my fellow Missourian.
I yield to my fellow Missourian.
Hi, my name's Julie. I'm an advocate for access to reproductive rights, and I am returning to the podium to continue sharing personal stories today. So we will return to Yvette's story. Now that time has gone by, I am glad about the decision I made. My boyfriend and I finally broke away from that obsessive, controlling, emotionally abusive relationship and have no contact with each other. I am doing well in school and have set goals for myself, and I'm happy that I'm taking care of myself instead of struggling with a baby, the boyfriend I had, and money. I am pro-choice because we, as women, have a right to decide for ourselves, and we should practice it as we desire. Another personal story. I come from a fiercely Catholic pro-life family and used to be pro-life myself. One day, a coworker's car broke down in my neighborhood, and I gave him a ride home. He took me out to dinner for drinks and dancing a few days later to thank me. We went back to my place, and he became extremely forceful. The more I resisted, the angrier and more forceful he got. I gave in because I was afraid he would seriously injure me. He was coming at me with such fury. I found out that I had gotten pregnant that first night. I felt like a fool not using emergency contraception. I tried to reason it away, pretend that I wasn't raped, despite all the scratches and bruises all over my body. Needless to say, he didn't want me or the baby. I believed he would rather hire someone to kill me than see me go through with the pregnancy. I also considered what I wanted for my own child. Did I want to have a child whose father wanted nothing to do with him or her, one who I was afraid might kill me and my baby? I knew I couldn't do it alone, but I also knew that if I went through with the pregnancy, I would not be able to give the baby up for adoption, and I would be forever tied to my ex that had raped me and left me. The entire situation was far too unhealthy to bring my child into. I felt abortion was the selfless thing for me to do, because intentionally bringing a child into that mess would have been completely irresponsible and unfair to any child. I don't regret the abortion. In fact, I would not be married to my loving, responsible husband who is an awesome father to my 2 kids and the one we have on the way. I am forever grateful that I was able to have a safe, legal abortion without harassment. My life, my decision. Another personal story. I was raised Catholic, and I was an ardent and fervent devotee while I still practiced. And then one day a few years ago, still pro-life and a bit green, having been in love with my partner for 2 years, I got pregnant. And I was about to start grad school. And I was scared and not sure I wanted a baby at that point in my life. But I was in love and decided to have the baby. And then I had a test that said something was wrong. My partner and I had experience with support living, and we thought it was a trisomy we'd probably go through with our pregnancy. And we were scared and we didn't know what to do. And we found out a little later that it was a pretty big problem. 1 in a million. Quality of life questionable. Major health problems for life. Might never walk. Might never talk. Might not swallow of his own volition. Yes, we knew he was a boy, and we had named him Noah. We did research. We had arguments. We debated things like how much quality is enough quality of life to bring a being into suffering. It was the worst month of my life. And at 22 weeks gestation, I decided with my partner not to continue with my pregnancy. And if you have the gall to tell me that that decision I made was out of anything but pure love, you have no idea what the true message of Christ is. I have never once regretted that decision, but it continues to break my heart. I had an abortion. It was my body, and at the time I was fortunate not to have been living within a political construct in which pregnant people are treated under a different set of laws than people who are not pregnant. Time to stop the shame. A personal story from Erica. I had already broken up with my boyfriend about 10 days prior to finding out I was pregnant because of his pushy sex tactics. I went to Planned Parenthood to learn about my options, although I was strongly already thinking of an abortion. In the end, the abortion was performed with a lot of guidance from the clinic. They made sure I was absolutely informed of my choices, and I made the right one for myself and my body. Looking back, I never regret my decision for 1 second, other than getting pregnant in the first place. Now I'm successful and married to a wonderful man, and we are trying to have our first child. The panic I felt when I found out I was pregnant really made me understand the women who were treated to back alley abortions. I would have done anything to have my abortion, and I am so thankful that I didn't have to make that kind of a decision. A personal story from Marla. I found I was pregnant 5 months before my high school graduation. I had a college scholarship and no money for a baby. I was 17 years old, scared, and very, very alone. Since my parents were fiercely anti-abortion, I decided not to tell them. Due to the laws in my state, I had to go in front of a judge and prove I was mature enough to obtain an abortion without parental consent. I went to the clinic alone, and I still remember the terrible things anti-abortion protesters screamed at me. Before my experience, I had no idea that 1 in 3 women will get an abortion. Now I am one of them. I am so proud to live in a country where abortion was an option, and I can only hope that every single woman will someday gain reproductive justice. A personal story from Jerry. When my wife was pregnant with our first child, she was going to school for mesotherapy in a building that also had an abortion clinic in it. At the time, she was about 4 months along and was showing a little. Every time she went to school, they had a security that had to escort her through a crazy mob of protesters who grabbed at her, yelling things like, "Don't kill your baby! You will hate yourself and regret it tomorrow." This really upset her that people would be so judgmental before they even knew the facts. From that point on, we both strongly felt that it should be a woman's right to choose, and that it should be no one's business but the woman and her God. Remember, God loves us unconditionally and gives us free will. Maybe everyone should follow this example. A personal story from Mariah. Shortly after turning 18 in my final semester of high school, I found out I was pregnant by my boyfriend of 2 years. I thought we were in love and could successfully raise a baby together, but upon telling him, he broke up with me and claimed we could only be together if I terminated my pregnancy. I was extremely heartbroken and in distress about what to do, but my relationship with my boyfriend was the least of my worries. After considering my options, I decided I would get an abortion. I'll never forget that cold January morning that my mother took me to a family planning group in a nearby town, and all the horrific pro-life protesters that nearly dissuaded me from my decision. Almost a year later, I look back and have no regrets about my decision because I know having a child would have ruined its life more than my own. Above all, the procedure really helped me to move on with my life and want to pursue a very successful future. I only wish I could change the fact that there are so many hateful groups that exist to torment women that choose abortion. I hope one day all women of all ages can reside in a nation that allows for guilt-free freedom of choice about their sexual health, and men's as well. A personal story from Andrea. In 2002, my life was saved by an emergency abortion and surgery at a city hospital in New York City. I was uninsured and bleeding to death from an ectopic pregnancy. Today, I am grateful to be alive and the mother of a beautiful boy. A personal story from Belladonna. After 2 live births and 1 miscarriage, I tried to have a 3rd child. After 4 sequential miscarriages, I had had enough. When I became pregnant again, I realized that I could not wait for the miscarriage and arranged a termination. It was awful and necessary and safe. My husband supported me all the way. I am still sad about all those losses, but I have the right to make the choice for my body myself. I can only hope that my daughter is also afforded that choice. A personal story from Jamie. In 2007, I was diagnosed with HELLP in my 5th month of a wanted pregnancy. Because my body was not responding to the labor-inducing drugs so that I could deliver my daughter, my body was dying quickly. The only way to cure this disease is to deliver the fetus. I only had so many hours to live, and my daughter was not going to make it no matter what happened. As a result, I had to be given an emergency abortion to save my life. If that were not an option under the laws, my family would have lost both me and my unborn baby. It is critical to keep the government out of our medical care and related private and personal decisions. The pro-life, anti-choice movement is set on a religious ideal that should not be relevant to our lawmaking body, separation of church and state. Statistics are people, not just numbers. If we change these laws based on only a few who need life-saving abortions, we are telling our country that no life is precious and women are dispensable. It is ridiculous that anyone would even challenge a person's right to govern their own bodies. A personal story from Christina. In May of 1980, I discovered that I was pregnant with what would have been my 2nd child. I started spotting on a Thursday, and I saw my doctor on Friday. There was no heartbeat, and the signs of pregnancy had disappeared. On Saturday morning, I started hemorrhaging. I passed approximately 15 fist-sized clots. Upon arrival to the hospital, a simple procedure was necessary to save my life. If the let them by let them die bill is allowed to pass, I would have died and my family would have been billed for my emergency room visit. 1 out of every 4 pregnancies ends in what is called spontaneous abortion still. This is totally frightening and appalling as a bill. A personal story from Lindy. Back in the 1960s, I had a very talented, intelligent, math whiz friend who had a life of success ahead of her. She needed an abortion. She belonged to a fundamentalist Christian church in which her father was a deacon. Abortion was not legal at that time, so she used a coat hanger to abort herself. She died during the attempt at the age of 23. It was such a terrible loss to her family, her friends, and to society. I can still see her in her casket. She was such a beautiful and sweet-natured young woman. She died because women were not valued in our society. This denial of abortions cannot happen again. It is not worth the loss of valuable young women in our society. A story from Beverly. In the late 1930s, my mother became pregnant. The fetus died and became infected. Because of the chilling effect of the total ban on legal abortion at the time, she could not get a D&C to save her life. If someone, a rogue doctor, a nurse, hadn't performed an ad hoc D&C in her hospital room, she would have died, and neither my brother nor I would be here today. Don't let the atmosphere that reigned then come back. Another personal story. I had breakthrough bleeding 2 weeks after a positive pregnancy test. Quantitative blood draws showed declining UCG levels. I was rushed to the OR where a D&C yielded no products of conception. It was subsequently surgically discovered that I had a ruptured tube from an ectopic pregnancy and was bleeding into my abdomen. I would have died without the surgery. A personal story from Kathy. At one point in time, I was very pro-life and couldn't imagine who would ever choose an abortion. Then came the day that I learned I was pregnant. I didn't choose to become pregnant. I had been raped. I struggled deciding what was right for me. Ultimately, I chose to abort. It was during those weeks that I decided pro-choice was the way to go. People can preach what they want. Until you are actually in that situation, you will never understand. I do not regret my choice and will fight to keep choice legal. Another personal story. When I was 18, I became pregnant by my boyfriend. At that time, abortion was illegal in the U.S. I chose to go to Mexico, where abortions were easily obtained. I am lucky to have survived. I will never forget that experience and the horrible pain I had to endure. I hope our country never returns to those days. Abortion will not go away, it will simply go underground, and women will suffer. A personal story from Carrie. At 15 years old, I was raped by a 17-year-old boy that I was dating. My father asked me if I wanted to marry this boy since I got pregnant. I said no, that I was raped, but men didn't believe that word in 1965. It was always the woman's fault. My father did finally send me to Puerto Rico with my mother to have an illegal abortion. I was able to go on and finish school and have a full career. I always wanted 12 children, but my career prevented it. My husband had 2 children that I had the privilege of helping raise from young teens. We have to protect the right that Roe v. Wade has given us today and make sure that insurance is there for others that need the help. A personal story from Katie. This story is about my great-grandma, Josephine, and why I am pro-choice. I have always been pro-choice and believe that what we choose to do with our bodies is nobody else's concern. But the story of my Grandma Jo cuts to the heart of why abortion must be kept safe and legal. My grandma became pregnant in 1948 with her second pregnancy. 12 weeks into the pregnancy, she became very ill and went to the doctor. He explained her fetus had died and was rotting inside of her, causing a mass infection. He told her it was illegal to treat this condition, and she would soon face death. Shocked and terrified, she left the office. A nurse followed her out and handed her a slip of paper with no name, just a number. The nurse said, "I did not give you this." Grandma went home and called the number. A man answered and only said, "Give me an address, I will be there at midnight." Midnight arrived, and a man came carrying a medical bag and a bucket. He told her to lie on her dining room table and open her legs. He performed the procedure right there. 4 years later, my grandfather was born. I would not be here today if it were not for a nurse with a slip of paper and an unknown man. He never charged my grandma a cent, but we owe him everything. Protect Roe versus Wade. A personal story from Rachel. In the beginning of a relatively new relationship, I faced an unplanned pregnancy. I was in no way able to carry out a pregnancy at this time. Not only was I not mature enough or financially ready, but even more so, I suffered from major depressive disorder and was recovering from an eating disorder as well. Had Planned Parenthood and the ability to get an abortion safely not been available, I would have starved that pregnancy right out of me, and you can bet I told them that. I couldn't face changes in my body. What would I have done without this choice in my life? I would have hurt myself and my child. For those who are anti-choice, there are women who have accidental pregnancies, who suffer mentally, and who are unable to raise a child. What would they have me do? They would tell me it is a gift. When there is a mental illness involved, an unplanned pregnancy can be dangerous to the mother and the fetus. Safe abortion must be available because sometimes it's just not possible for a woman to continue with a pregnancy. And whatever her choice, that is a difficult choice to make and should be respected. Another personal story. I am in the middle of my college career. My husband is in the military and also going to college, and we live in a studio apartment on campus. We have neither the time, the money, nor the room to take care of a child. I went to the emergency room for bleeding and abdominal pain. The pregnancy was supposedly healthy, but I do live in a state that condemns abortion altogether. My husband and I decided together that we would abort. He supported me the whole way. The protesters outside of the clinic were saying, "You have other choices." What those people don't understand is we aren't stupid or ignorant. We just can't take care of a baby, and we won't force ourselves to. And we won't force that child to live a difficult life either. A personal story from Stephanie. Almost a year ago, I rushed into the emergency room one morning with intense abdominal pain. Within the course of the next few hours, I learned I was 7 weeks pregnant and that it was an ectopic pregnancy. My husband and I were using birth control, and I had no symptoms of pregnancy, so the news came as a shock to both of us. I underwent emergency surgery immediately and had to have my fallopian tube removed. The surgeon told my husband that if I had waited 1 or 2 more days, the tube would have likely burst. I never thought of this life-saving surgery as an abortion until I went for my yearly OBGYN exam a few weeks ago, and the nurse told me I needed to check the box on my medical forms to indicate that I had had an abortion. I am telling my story now because today I read the Protect Life Act, which is pending in Congress. If such a law had been in effect last November, there is a chance I would not be alive today. Under the proposed law, the hospital could have refused to perform an operation that saved my life. I am fortunate that I live in a city with multiple hospitals. What about women who live in rural areas with access to only one hospital? I am fortunate that I have excellent medical insurance and my hospital bills were paid for. What if my insurance company refused to cover it and I had to go into debt to pay the over $15,000 bill for my surgery and overnight hospital stay? This was a difficult experience for me. I am sharing my story because I don't want any woman to be denied the same life-saving medical treatment I have had. A personal story from Sarah. My stepmother passed away today. One prominent memory was when she told me the story behind her birth. She was born in Boston during the pre-Roe days. She was then adopted by a loving couple. The doctor that delivered her set up the adoption. He had done this many times. But he was also there as a safe option for women that looked for an abortion provider. Through word of mouth, women were able to turn to him. He practiced in a safe environment using safe methods. He broke the law so that women didn't have to die needlessly. Eventually, he was arrested. After he was released, he ended his abortion services and continued arranging adoptions. but the fact that he was willing to do both truly defines pro-choice. Not too long ago, Massachusetts started allowing people born before a certain date to access their adoption records. After over 6 decades, my stepmother was able to learn about her birth mother. It turned out to be a teenage girl. Surprisingly, she did not feel rejected. She understood that her mother put her up for an adoption as an act of love. She was grateful for the doctor that gave her, her birth mother, her adoptive parents, and countless other women a chance at a decent life. A doctor that trusted women. A personal story from Sarah. I am a firm believer in being pro-choice. I was in a 7-year abusive relationship that left me hospitalized and with PTSD. I became pregnant with this individual, and I knew that I could not keep my pregnancy. He was not a contributing member of society and extremely volatile. I faced domestic violence every day for 7 years and only can imagine what he would have done to a child. I was living in Boston at the time and went to Planned Parenthood for my services. They have buffer zones set up, but anti-choice individuals still crucify you when you walk in with gruesome pictures and yelling terrible things at you. They actually took a picture of my license plate and placed it on www.babykiller.com. I had to threaten to take legal action to have this removed. That website has since been shut down, but women still face anti-choice groups at clinics all the time. It makes an already difficult situation even worse. We need to stand together as people and stop the war on women immediately. I've since moved on with my life, obtained my master's, met an amazing man who I am in a loving, supportive, mutually respecting relationship with. I don't regret having an abortion for 1 second. In fact, the more women that I have talked to, I found that many of them were in similar situations and went through the same process. Another personal story. I had my first child when I was only 15 years old, a 9th grader in junior high. I wasn't on birth control and knew nothing much of it at the time, due not only to my parents not talking about it, but also to the fact that the school I went to did not teach sex education as an informative class, but more as an abstinence promotion. I finished high school barely by having to enroll in a homeschool program, which allowed me to take care of my daughter and finish my classes. When I turned 20, I had my second child. He was a planned pregnancy with my now partner. After my son was born, I decided that I was going to go on full-time birth control and started with the pills, which I could barely afford to begin with. 2 months after he was born, I found out, yet again, that I was pregnant. I couldn't fathom how this could happen, simply because I was taking the pill correctly. I had just gone back to work, working 12-hour shifts at a local hospital. I was worried about the future of my children, and in that worry, I decided to have an abortion. I knew little of access to this in my state, but I later found out that there were only 2 clinics that offered abortion in Arkansas. I called them and scheduled an appointment for my next day off and arranged for my sister, who had had an abortion there years before, to take me. When we arrived, we were bombarded with pro-lifers. They thought since I was dressed in my scrubs for work, that I worked there and that my sister was a patient. They called me a baby killer and my sister a murderer. They stood across the street from us, screaming other profane things and begging us to turn back to the right path, telling us that we were going to hell. I was clearly upset before I even got to the clinic, but to have other women yelling at me and condemning my decision was horrific. The doctor I saw confirmed my pregnancy and asked if this was still what I wanted to do. I broke down in that moment and cried to her that I had done the right thing, was on birth control, already had 2 small children. She quickly calmed me down by telling me that she too had a similar experience in terms of becoming pregnant on the pill and having an abortion. She hugged me and told me it was my choice to decide what was best. Needless to say, I had the abortion. I thought before I had gone that I would be overcome with grief, but actually it was the opposite. I was relieved. I no longer worried about the future of my children or my future. Today in Arkansas, there is only 1 clinic in the center of the state. This clinic is now under fire from the many pro-life campaigners that want to shut it down and block their services indefinitely. I am pro-choice because I believe every woman has the right to decide, the right to their health care, and the right to birth control. No one should tell a woman what is right for her or make her decisions for her. I plan to continue to fight in my state to keep my Planned Parenthood clinic open and to allow more clinics to be opened up soon so that every woman can have the choice that I did. A personal story from Nikki. I'm sure my story is like many others. I'm a struggling college student. May I also add, I'm in a diverse field for my schooling, automotive technology. I'm the only female in my program. I had a short fling with a guy that I knew and got pregnant from this one encounter. While I'm barely able to support myself, I knew I could not risk my entire future on having a baby. Even though adoption was available, I could not finish my schooling. Being around cars and the chemicals and substances and work I have put into them would be harmful to me and my baby. I decided to have an abortion. While it's hard to grasp the idea of just getting rid of it in some people's minds, I was risking even more by trying to hang on to it. I didn't do it because I was selfish or because I didn't want to take care of another life. But why bring that life into a world where I could not provide for it? College students in the state of Utah cannot get insurance, especially if you are on financial aid. I like having all of the options possible, and there are so many circumstances where a woman needs to have choice. Trust me, you don't know what you will do unless you are in that position. A personal story from Susan. I got pregnant from my second sexual experience at age 21. I was so naive. I had a backroom abortion in 1965 in New York City. I was told to go alone to an apartment in Harlem. I was given something to make me unconscious and told to go home when I awoke. I cannot remember how it was administered, and I woke up alone. I was in great pain. The next day I returned and again was knocked out for the abortion, so I never saw anyone. Obviously, this was a very traumatic experience, and every April since then, I remember the pain and suffering I underwent. Obviously, I could have died. After that trauma, I got a diaphragm and never practiced unprotected sex. Thank goodness for choice for my daughter and all women. I would be happy to share my story. At age 68, I still remember. A personal story from Lila. I'm in a long-distance relationship with the most wonderful man in the world. I got pregnant last October and was crushed. I had already raised one child as a single parent, and I was terrified of what would happen with two. My boyfriend is in grad school, and in no way could we derail our future because of a faulty condom. So after several nights of tears and heartache together, we made the decision to terminate the pregnancy. It was the hardest and most painful choice I have ever made, and it still weighs heavy on my heart like a brick-filled bag. As much as I mourn for the loss of the pregnancy, I know I made the right choice. I was asked recently if now, in hindsight, that I feel differently about the pro-choice movement, if the sorrow of the loss has lured me into changing my beliefs, and I said no. Abortion may not be the right move for every woman, but the choice should still be available, and for those who think it's easy for any woman to make this choice, they are foolish. It's a hard and soul-pressing choice that will always haunt me. Another personal story. I had my first abortion at age 17. It was illegal at that time in every state but California and New York. My only other option was an unwed mother's home. We needed cash. I was lucky. My family doctor gave me the contact info for an MD. The anesthesia didn't take. It was so painful I gagged. My mother held my hand. I was about to graduate from high school. The doctor sent me home with antibiotics in case of bleeding. A month later, I was at college. I hemorrhaged and was afraid to tell anyone. I took the medicine the doctor had prescribed me. The bleeding stopped. I was one of the lucky ones. One of my friends, a doctor's daughter, ended up in an intensive care unit with a life-threatening infection after an illegal abortion. A personal story from Jen. I was 19 when I found out that I was pregnant. I was a freshman in college working part-time for a retail store, and was in a brand new relationship. With no college degree or real career to support myself, let alone a child, and the uncertainty about my new relationship, I decided an abortion was the right choice for me. Today, at age 26, I am a college graduate with a career in the government sector. I am happily married, and yes, to the man who I became pregnant by in college, and we currently have a very healthy and very happy 2-year-old daughter. I don't have one single regret about my decision, and neither does my husband. We chose to wait to have a family because we wanted to be able to provide for a child and give them every opportunity possible to succeed. A personal story from Jenny. When I was 19 years old, I became pregnant. While I was in love with my then boyfriend, whom I later married, I knew that this was not the right time for me to have a child, and it would not have been fair to that child to have been born at that time in his or her parents' lives. Fortunately, I had a choice. I decided to terminate the pregnancy and did so as a logical, rational decision. I dedicated myself to my education and my career. I worked for 25 years in advertising, rising to be president of an ad agency. I never looked back on that decision to question it. I look back on the fact that I had a choice and I made the one that was right for me. I now have a 19-year-old daughter, and she knows my story, and she understands the responsibility that comes with a sexual relationship. It is important for me that she has a choice and makes the one that is best for her. We both believe that this is a decision for a woman to make, not our government, and together we support a woman's right to choose. A story from Kathleen. I was raised Catholic, so I didn't know anything about sex or birth control. I wasn't taught in school either. Birds and bees was the thing then. I got pregnant and married at 18. I still didn't know much but was taking birth control pills and ended up getting pregnant at age 20. My husband and I were young, inexperienced, and very, very poor. We knew there was no way we could handle another child. I am thankful every day for Planned Parenthood. I not only had the abortion, they gave me resources for better family planning. I eventually had another child, and my husband and I just celebrated our 38th wedding anniversary. Do I regret it? No way. Another personal story. I was enlisted in the Air Force. I was pregnant, planned, and after 2 months began having a miscarriage. I was stationed overseas, and due to the new Bush bill restricting federal hospitals and money for abortive procedures, I could not get any medical attention for the miscarriage because it would be a D&C, and that is not covered for active duty military personnel. I could go off base and get an abortion out of pocket, but who has $700 or more for that? I had to endure nearly 3 weeks of bleeding and passing tissue before I developed a fever and went to the base hospital. I was immediately sent to the OR to have a D&C to prevent me from possibly dying of blood loss. It was difficult to become pregnant after that, and I have 8 years between children. I found out that I had a molar pregnancy and that there was never a fetus or viable human being. It still haunts me to this day, and I never want any woman to go through this, especially one who is fighting for the freedom of those who choose to restrict women's rights. A personal story from Rachel Elizabeth. My cousin molested me for a decade and even raped me at one point. I had a pregnancy scare. That's why I'm pro-choice. There's more to it, of course. I lived in a tiny town of 5,000 in the upper Midwest, where the nearest hospital that was capable of even handling childbirth was 45 minutes away. Was there access to abortion? Yeah, right. Keep dreaming. I couldn't even hide the pregnancy and just adopt the baby out. I was too young to drive, so I couldn't get to the nearest hospital with OBGYN services to have the child delivered safely in the first place. Pregnancy shouldn't be a thing of horror. It shouldn't be something that makes a person feel re-victimized over and over and over again. It should be a wonderful thing, full of joy and wonder. That's what supporting the pro-choice movement boils down to me, making sure that pregnancy is the wonderful experience that it should be. A personal story from Pat.
No.
I was a nursing student and then in practice in the late 1950s and early 60s. I saw the ravages to health, well-being, and life that came with women having no choice but to go to some backstreet abortionist or attempt to abort themselves. I saw women who were so badly infected that they nearly, or did, lose their lives, or at least ended up sterile. I also saw the obscene practice of getting psychiatric consultation, where the result was a woman being diagnosed as having a mental illness in order to have a legal abortion. Then, the mental illness label was on her record forever. I saw women who were unable to terminate a pregnancy go through with it and end up being shunned and shamed in their communities. Some of those women ended up being the ones whose babies were taken from them and adopted out with no recourse to be a good family. Women without choice are victims in so many ways it is unconscionable. A personal story from Catherine. I have a dear friend who discovered she was carrying a severely deformed child in her second trimester. The ultrasound showed a serious malfunction with the skull malformed and no possibility of brain function. She had a late-term abortion, and while it was terrible, it was the right thing to do. On examination, there was not even a brainstem present in the fetus. The child would not have lived for more than a few minutes after birth, even with medical intervention and life support. Making late-term abortion illegal in these circumstances is nothing less than sadism. A woman suffers enough with a diagnosis like that. Dragging it out is simply inhumane. A personal story from Anne. I worked at an abortion clinic 2 years ago, supporting women and their choices. Although I haven't yet faced the choice myself, I've always supported women's reproductive rights. After several years of trying to get pregnant, I finally did go through infertility treatment. For 2 weeks, I was settling into the idea that I would be the parent of a healthy baby. I was told at my first ultrasound that I had several eggs implanted, not just one. After much discussion with my husband, we decided to do selective reduction, a process that reduces 3 or more fetuses to 1 or 2, which is safer for both the mother and the child. I called around to several maternal fetal doctors in my area who stated, "We don't do abortions here." I called my insurance company for a referral, but was told, "We don't pay for abortions, honey. Try your local clinic." After much research on the web, I located a doctor in New York who performed the procedure. I'm angry that the infertility treatment caused this dilemma for myself and my husband. Moreover, I'm angry that I was faced with several nasty comments from nurses and office staff about it being my own fault. I have the right to have a healthy and happy child. I also have the right to have a safe and healthy pregnancy. A personal story from Carolyn. In 2008, I became pregnant while using the NuvaRing form of birth control. I had a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old and a career as a professor in a master's program. I was overwhelmed. When I told my husband I was pregnant, he said, "I guess we're having another baby." I knew in my heart that a third child would stretch us thin, emotionally, time-wise, financially, and mentally. When I brought up the topic of an abortion, my husband said that he had never considered it an option. After all, we are a 2-income family with financial security, a great support network of grandparents, friends, and neighbors, and we adore our children. After many days and nights of discussions, he came to understand that I felt I was unable to handle a third child. He understood that, as the mother, I bear the majority of the work when it comes to our family. I had an abortion in August 2009 at 10 weeks. It's still difficult emotionally. However, I know in my heart that we did what was right and what was best for our family. I have never regretted that decision. I feel incredible anger at the anti-choice movement. Are any of those people going to come to my home and help me raise a third child? Are they going to pay for that child's needs? Help me get that child to bed after an exhausting day? Pay for that child's education? This is my body, and I am incredibly grateful that I am in control of it. A personal story from Dawn. I got pregnant in the summer of 2008. My husband and I were thrilled. We had been trying for about 6 months, and it finally happened. At 11 weeks of gestation, we found out that the fetus had an anomaly. We were devastated. This was a very wanted child. We terminated the pregnancy 2 days later in a hospital. My OB performed the D&C. The doctor considered this a condition not compatible with life. Unbeknownst to me, my insurance carrier later refused to cover the procedure. I have come to find out that the insurance carrier had no choice in covering the procedure. Federal law prohibits them from covering the procedure. I am a federal government employee, and in 1995, a provision was slipped into an appropriations bill stating that insurance carriers for plans offered to federal government employees are prohibited from paying for abortion services unless the pregnancy is the result of an act of rape, incest, or threatens the life of the woman. I received a letter from the insurance carrier from my appeal of the initial denial. The letter stated that the condition did not threaten my ability to carry to term, so the denial of benefits was correct. It appears that this carrier was bound by federal law. If I were covered by this carrier under a non-federal plan, I would have been covered for a therapeutic abortion. I resent that my health care and the health care of all female federal employees is compromised by this law. I have worked for pro-choice causes for the better half of my life, doing a variety of volunteer activities as well as donating money. I support choice in all circumstances. A personal story from Jennifer. My mother was with a man for 4 years, and she got pregnant with his baby. Not knowing that the man was a hardcore cocaine user, she was excited about being pregnant again. She went to the doctor, and he told her that the baby wasn't well. The heart was not beating correctly. After a few weeks of tests, they concluded that if she carried the baby to full term and attempted to have it, it would be threatening her life, and the baby probably would not live. She had to have an abortion to save her own life. If my mother had had that baby, I would not be here today. A personal story from Molly. When I graduated from college in 1975, I worked in a Planned Parenthood for 3 years. It was fantastic to work in a facility which provided safe medical procedures for women. When I was pregnant at age 41 with my second child, amniocentesis results showed that my baby was suffering from trisomy 18. She was an Edwards baby. I learned that Edwards babies don't usually make it out of the hospital and have conditions inconsistent with life. My husband and I opted for termination for the sake of our baby and our family. With help from the counselors at the clinic, which I had previously referred women to, a very difficult situation was made tolerable. This was the most difficult decision I have ever made, and it angers me greatly when people assume that every person seeking an abortion is looking for an easy way out. A personal story from Cynthia. Although I experienced having an abortion at a time when it was legal, I feel a strong need to weigh in here. I am almost 57 years old. In 1958, my parents divorced and remarried. My stepfather molested me from the time I was 6 years old until I was able to put a stop to it, after 10 years of victimization. I am lucky. I found a powerful tool within my Buddhist religion in 1974 and no longer live in the shadow of this abuse. I keep reading opinions of people who do not feel that an abortion based on rape or incest is justifiable. I had to have an abortion based on my health issues when I was in my 30s. The child was wanted, and my husband and I would have loved this child dearly. It was one of the hardest things I have ever had to go through. Thinking about what would it would have been like to have had the child conceived due to incest I suffered as a young teen, well, I admit I probably would have committed suicide. I do not think any politician, especially one who has not, and if male, never will, walk in these shoes, has the right to judge, let alone make laws on it. A personal story from Jennifer. While pregnant with my first child, it became very clear to me that the man I had been planning to marry was an alcoholic and very abusive. I knew I had to get away from him and raise my daughter. Shortly after her birth, on a night during the breakup process, he picked me up in his car for us to go talk. The next thing I knew, I was forced to have sex and found myself pregnant again. I was facing dropping out of nursing school and a very bleak future of staying with him and 2 babies under the age of 1. I was very unclear during this very painful time in my life that I only had one choice. I was either going to have the second child and stop living, or terminate and start over with just me and my child. I have never for a second thought I made the wrong decision, as painful as it was. I was forced into a situation that I did not choose, and I was and am very grateful that I had the right to choose the outcome for my daughter and myself. Another personal story. I had just turned 15 when I found out I was pregnant. A freshman in high school, no job, no license, and a 16-year-old boyfriend who was soon to be a father just did not add up right in my head. How could I raise a baby? Where would I get the money to keep my baby fed and clothed? Everything ran through my head, including the question, why me? I had plans. I wanted to graduate high school and go to college, and bringing a baby into the picture put a wall up between me and my dreams. I was 9 weeks when I had the abortion. I was greeted by unpleasant people shoving signs in my face, telling me what's right for me and my child. Yes, I chose to have sex, but I did not choose to get pregnant. I am pro-choice. Why should other people decide what I should do with my body and my child? I was young and 100% not ready to become a mother. A personal story from Rye. Choosing inspiration, that's how I think of my own experience of abortion. Not that at the time, or even now, did I ever really consider having a child. I myself was still a child at 17 when I found out I was pregnant. I still am in many ways. Of course, I knew of the controversy surrounding the issue, and I had seen it firsthand every month when I went to buy my pill pack from the local Planned Parenthood, local being 45 minutes one way. I had always sympathized with other women who had to endure the ridiculous and unnecessary behavior of the angry people on the sidewalks who had nothing better to do with their time than hold deceitful pictures of bloody fetuses, nothing at all like what a first trimester fetus would look like, and scream from their scripted propaganda. It enraged me that they lacked the human decency to let a woman walk from her car to the door when they could have no idea why they were there. When it was my turn to be that woman showing up for her appointment, the man on the sidewalk with his bullhorn seemed to me to be the most horrible human being on the planet. Could he not see how young I was? That I couldn't even fix the busted front of my car, much less provide for a baby? Apparently not, because he yelled anyway. Sitting in the waiting room with the 6 other women who were there for the same procedure as I was struck by the diversity of our group. A few were like me and didn't even look like they should be out of high school, much less having a baby. One woman had her toddler with her, and the others looked to be in varying stages of life and social economic status. We traded shy glances and awkward conversation until the mother of the toddler broke the tension by saying, "Well, everyone can see why I'm here. I thought that idiot outside was going to have a coronary." We all laughed and responded with, "I knows," and "what a jerks." I think we all felt relieved that, regardless of the reason, we had made the same choice and we were not alienated here in the waiting room like we had been walking by the front door. This experience and everything that followed inspired me to change my mind, my awareness, and my life. I am now married to the same boy I was with then, my first and only, my best friend. My life is driven by passion for women's care. I am in school to become a certified nurse midwife and am determined to move to a state where I can get my license to provide abortion services. My dream is to have my own practice and to give women a warmer, more personal experience of family planning. I absolutely cannot wait. Bring on the future. A personal story from Rob.
I'm called Missouri, and I'd like to make an inquiry.
Yes, I yield.
My name's Peter, and I support women's rights. Here's a personal story from Rob. My mom was born in 1911. She was ahead of her time. The one issue that Mom was quite adamant about was abortion. I was confused. Mom was nuts about babies. She was an OB/GYN nurse. She worked in the delivery room at one time. I had to ask. Mom said, yes, there are better choices that could have been taken, but there weren't. What we have to do now is protect life through safe clinical procedures. See, I didn't know that Mom had seen over 30 years worth of the results of botched illegal abortion. My mom is gone now. I will not let what she fought for to be trampled into the ground. This is why I say to be brave women. I think she should go, but I will do my best. Another personal story from the I found out I was about what my choices were. I was prepared and felt absolutely alone at college. It was only the third week of being there, and I had been having trouble adjusting. When the option of abortion turned about, I had always thought that I was pro-choice, and I could not tell a woman it's wrong for her to get an abortion, but it wasn't for me. I never thought I'd become a teacher, though, and that changed everything. I wanted to go to college, learn, I had a plan, and even physically being pregnant, I decided could take away some of my experience. So with the support of my mother, who had an abortion when she was little older than me and my father, I made the choice to have an abortion. And I was afraid to tell almost any peers back home, even some of my closest friends. They would have criticized me greater than any protester outside the clinic the day of my procedure could. I am pro-choice. For every teenage/young adult woman who's afraid to voice her choice because of how politics and religion has influenced her peers. For every girl who's been the only one brave enough to say, yes, I yield the mic.
Feeling power.
My fellow Missourians, we are
Oh, the light's still plugged in.
Just unplug the computer, I guess.
There we go.
There it is.
okay. We're on the move. Peter, can you hold this pen down? And we'll be right back.
Here.
Okay. Okay. We're connected. Oh, what's your cord? Oh, shit. Okay. Put the computer down and I'll try it. Somebody set this back up. It's still loud.
We just had to make a quick move. Here we are. We're going to need some parts to cover the wind blowing this way. Don't you think? Yeah. Okay.
It's still us walking down, but
Okay. So we're continuing with the Women's Filibuster after our committee anniversary in November. And the beauty of live streaming is that you got to follow us through that exciting move. We are amazing personal stories, and so I am going to pick up with Stacy, age 39. When I was in high school, my mom took me to my first rally in Washington. It's a little bit dark in here, so you have to bear with me while I read the print. At the same time, she discussed birth control, abortion, and the struggle that women went through to have the right to control their own reproduction. She made certain that I was well educated, and when I went to college, I made certain that I escorted women at clinics who volunteered at NARAL to ensure that we could always have the right to choose. I was taught that you had to be vigilant because there were people that could take this right away. I was on birth control and assumed that I would never need to use the right to an abortion because I would take precautions. Well, I became the 1% statistic that gets pregnant on the hill. I was living in Chicago. recall that this option was available to me as I was 21 years old and completely incapable of raising a child. I cannot imagine where my life would be if I had been forced to have a baby. I am grateful to my mom, most of all, and to all of the women who have fought to continue the fight to ensure that I have the right to choose.
My fellow Bavarian, I'd like to make an inquiry.
I would like to hear from my fellow Syrian. Come on up. You're on today.
I was a Peter, and I have women's rights. Here's a few personal stories. The day the appointment came, I was very scared. My parents went with me, and as we were driving into the parking lot, a man came up to the car and threw a poster on the windshield so we couldn't see where we were going. I was a pro-life person, so I went to crash. When I got out of the car, there were maybe 10 men that started yelling things out. I was a killer. My parents were killers. Normal stuff. Then they took it to a new level and started to throw big rocks at me. I found this so strange because I was always told that pro-life people wanted to protect us, not hurt us. They didn't care. They kept throwing rocks and yelling things. My dad actually had my head between his side and his arm because they were trying to hit me in the head. I got in and talked to the nurse about my decision. I was there for about 3 hours before the procedure took place. This is not a religious issue, it's a health issue. For anyone to think that making this decision was really easy is just wrong. But it was the best decision for me, and it was my decision. If I had to do it over again, I would. I will fight for the pro-choice movement until the day I die. Another personal story from Natasha. When I was a teenager, my mother told me that she had an abortion when she was my age. She said the decision was very hard one and that the aftermath had been difficult. But she said that the act changed her life. Without the freedom to decide what happened to her own body, her life would have been a very different one. She wouldn't have had one. I am pro-choice because abortion rights allowed my mother to make the most important decision of her life on her own, the privacy and dignity. I'm going to read a policy paper. It's from the Women's Health Issues Journal. It's called Women's Perspectives on Ultrasound Viewing in the Abortion Care Context. From Katrina Kemport, PhD, Felisa Preskill, MPP, Kate Cockrell, MPH, Tracy A. Whites, PhD and MPA. The abstract. Purpose. In recent years, states have passed a range of regulations regarding ultrasound procedures and abortion care. Abortion rights opponents have promoted ultrasound viewing, believing that women who view their own ultrasound images are likely to be dissuaded from abortion. Abortion rights advocates, in contrast, routinely oppose these regulations, citing concerns that ultrasound viewing in the abortion context will be emotionally difficult for women. However, no empirical research has examined the effects of ultrasound viewing in unwanted pregnancies. Methods. We conducted in-depth interviews with 20 respondents who received an ultrasound as part of their abortion care in one of 2 states in the American West. Interview transcripts were analyzed using grounded theory and a matrix technique with discussion of ultrasound viewing and regulations about ultrasound viewing. Results. Respondents' accounts offer support for anti-abortion claims that ultrasound viewing can dissuade women from abortion, as well as support for abortion rights claims that viewing an ultrasound can cause emotional difficulty for a woman planning to abort. Interviews point to unexpected outcomes of ultrasound viewing, including reports that viewing better enabled respondents to cope with their abortion. Conclusions. Ultrasound viewing does not have a singular effect. These data suggest that current assumptions about viewing effects are inaccurate or at the least incomplete. We do not find support for legislating mandatory ultrasound viewing in abortion care. Questions about clinical care practices are best addressed in the medical context, not the legislative arena. Introduction. In recent years, ultrasound viewing in the abortion care setting has received a great deal of attention as more states pass regulations mandating specific ultrasound procedures. The use of ultrasound in obstetrical care at all is a relatively recent development. Only in the last few decades have medical professionals regularly used ultrasound imaging to aid in assessing the health of a developing fetus. In parallel, ultrasonography has become routine abortion care, used to establish pregnancy, confirm gestational age, and check for multiple pregnancies. 24 states have laws regulating ultrasound and abortion providing facilities. The context of these laws vary, but from requiring that all women receive an ultrasound in advance of an abortion to requiring that women do ultrasound others. Activists on both sides of the abortion debate voice strong claims about the effects of these laws. Abortion rights opponents have promoted ultrasound viewing under the rubric of informed consent, believing that women who view their own ultrasounds are less likely to have an abortion than women who do not. Abortion rights advocates, in contrast, routinely oppose these regulations, questioning the appropriateness of legislators determining components of medical care. Moreover, they challenge these regulations' content, citing concerns about the impact of such laws on women's emotional experience of abortion. The ultrasound viewing will exacerbate emotional pregnancy. Neither side claims, however, is grounded in empirical research. To date, research on the effects of viewing ultrasound images has been conducted only in the context of wanted pregnancies. In studies of wanted pregnancies, research has identified ultrasound viewing as a positive opportunity to facilitate maternal fetal bonding. Mitchell, for example, finds that viewing ultrasound images helps some women feel the pregnancy as real in a way they have not previously. Ultrasound usage does not live without its critics. However, some feminist thinkers have asserted that ultrasound reduces women's agency of pregnancy, remaking the doctor as the knower of the truth of the pregnancy, positioning the fetus as a separate, preeminent entity. Preliminary research to date has specifically examined ultrasonography of women with unwanted pregnancies. Scholars have speculated on the effects of abortion contracts. The 1983 editorial by Picture and Evans raised the possibility, albeit without empirical evidence, that ultrasound viewing would dissuade them from abortions. Two non-peer-reviewed studies conducted in crisis pregnancy centers report on evidence of this effect. January 2006, Caroline 2003. Despite this lack of empirical evidence of the effects of ultrasound viewing on women seeking abortions, participants in the abortion debate, both for and against abortion rights, have made assertions about the effect seeing images of fetuses will have on women seeking abortion. Abortion rights opponents, for instance, have presumed that, like in wanted pregnancies, ultrasound viewing will compel maternal fetal bonding when women submitting to continue their pregnancy. In reference to a piece of ultrasound regulation, one state legislator explained, "With this, we're hoping that by making them here, making them sign a sheet, it will be less important to make that decision." Sickler, 2008. Meanwhile, abortion rights supporters have also presumed ultrasound viewing will cause maternal fetal bonding, the ultrasound regulations as an attempt to coerce women's decision making. For example, in a well-publicized article, an abortion clinic staff member stated, "The bottom line is, no one is going to want an abortion after she sees a sonography." For the women who view their ultrasound image and proceed with the abortion rights supporters decry the potential of these images to be emotionally upsetting. Both sets of claims assume specific effects of ultrasound viewing on women seeking abortion. This paper offers a preliminary exploration of the impacts of ultrasound viewing on women with unwanted pregnancies who are seeking abortion, presenting findings from a small qualitative study of women seeking abortion care in 2 politically conservative states. At the facilities where we recruited, all patients received ultrasound as part of their pre-abortion care and were permitted, but not legally required, to view their ultrasound image if they desired. These data provide insight into how women who view their ultrasound image experience that viewing, pointing to both unexpected and expected outcomes. As activists opposed to abortion rights predict, some women told stories of being persuaded to continue a pregnancy after viewing their ultrasounds. In addition, as abortion rights advocates expect, some women reported feeling upset by the viewing. but continued with their plan to terminate pregnancy. Finally, significantly diverging from both sets of expectations, other women reported positive feelings about seeing their ultrasound image. Methods. As part of a qualitative study, we understood women's perspectives on abortion regulation. We conducted semi-structured interviews with 20 women who received an ultrasound as part of their abortion care at 2 facilities in the state in the American South, and at 1 facility in the state in the Midwest. Because civil research has examined the role of ultrasound in unwanted pregnancies in abortion care, specifically qualitative exploratory research is most appropriate. Respondents were recruited at the facilities during one of their abortion care appointments, initial consultation, procedure visit, or follow-up. Women were eligible to participate in the study if they'd undergone an abortion in the past month or were currently seeking an abortion, were over 18 and spoke English. We presumed that women who sought and or obtained an abortion were carrying unwanted pregnancy, allowing us insight into the experience of ultrasound viewing in the context of unwanted pregnancy. I recruited participants at the 3 distinct stages of their abortion care: before the abortion, the day of the abortion, and 2 days after the abortion. We aim to capture a sample of respondents with different experiences in ultrasound. Women at their consultation appointment had not yet received an ultrasound, nor had the opportunity to do it at this care facility, although we know that they may have had a prior opportunity at another facility to see their ultrasound. Women at the facility got their procedure day, and those recruited at their follow-up appointment had already had the opportunity to see their ultrasound. Study personnel did not recruit women directly. Potentially eligible women who were approached by a health worker, nurse, clinician who gave them a study flyer and offered to introduce them to a field investigator. From these contacts, study personnel spoke to 32 women. Of these, 30 women made interview appointments and 20 completed their interviews. For women recruited at their initial consultation, interviews took place after they had received their facility-sponsored counseling, which included an ultrasound. Women recruited at later stages of the abortion care likewise had already completed counseling and received an ultrasound. Interviews were conducted in person because of expectations that the in-person format would allow greater respondent comfort and rapid around a potentially sensitive subject. Our decision to conduct all interviews in person, coupled with the fact that many of the patients served by these facilities traveled great distances for their care and thus had very limited availability, made scheduling difficult and led to the relatively high failure to complete an interview rate. We have no reason to expect that there were any systematic differences between those able to be interviewed and those who were unable to participate. Participants were paid $30 to compensate them for their time. No information was collected, cider notes, or pseudo-entries below. All study procedures received approval from the Institutional Review Board at the Office of Institution. For more detail on the data collection methods, see Cocktail and Lights 2010. Interviews were semi-structured and included questions on women's knowledge of, opinions about, and perceived personal impact of the laws in their state regarding abortion care. Interviews were retrospective, not limited to discussion of the current pregnancy. We matched our interview questions to the participants' fluency and healthcare policy, adjusting the interview questions to fulfill. Interviewers asked follow-up and probing questions to elicit rich narratives of women's experience of abortion-related regulations. Although we anticipated wide variation in women's reports of their experience for abortion regulations, themes emerged quickly and saturation was reached with a relatively small sample. All respondents completed a demographic questionnaire including information about age, race, ethnicity, education, and pregnancy history. Interviews ranged in length from 45 to 60 minutes. They were tape recorded and transcribed. Transcriptions were compared with audio recordings, checked for accuracy, and analyzed at lab speed 5.0 using rapid theory analytical techniques. Charles, 2006. Initial line-by-line coding led to the development of actual codes based on themes discovered in the text. Codes produce useful categories of behaviors, experiences, feelings, and beliefs. We conducted further analysis using the matrix technique, with Robinson and Colley in 2005, which allowed us to compare responses from cross participants to explore the opinions of each participant across questions. Results. Table 1 presents demographic characteristics for all respondents. Respondents' accounts offer some support for the claims of abortion rights opponents. The ultrasound viewing can dissuade women from terminating a pregnancy. Some support for claims by abortion rights supporters that viewing an ultrasound can be emotionally difficult for a woman intending to terminate her pregnancy. However, interviews also point to unexpected outcomes of ultrasound viewing, including reports that viewing better enabled respondents to cope with their abortion. Although we anticipated the variation in women's narratives about ultrasound based on the stage in the care process, i.e. before or after the abortion, we found no differences, though did not specify care stage for respondents discussed below. Key qualitative findings are summarized in Table 2. The expected. Stories from some respondents supported the contentions of both sides of the debate over ultrasound viewing. Amanda's, 25, white, experience with ultrasound viewing in her prior pregnancy offers some support for anti-abortion contentions that ultrasound viewing will prevent women to continue unintended pregnancy. Amanda became pregnant at age 23 as a result of the rape. She had 3 children already and initially considered abortion. On the one hand, she said, I wanted to have the baby from the pregnancy, no matter what happened. On the other, she experienced pressure from others to terminate the pregnancy because of the rape. Amanda made an appointment at an abortion clinic. She said, I paid the money to went and had the ultrasound. The lady asked me if I wanted to look. I didn't think too much about it. I went ahead and looked, and it was my daughter. She was moving around and freaking me out. I left and didn't go back. I walked out, and that was it, and I had my daughter. From the outset, Amanda experienced ambivalence about having an abortion. Ambivalence that was resolved in her account by viewing the ultrasound. Any effect of the ultrasound viewing seems to be limited to that particular pregnancy, however. As Amanda received an abortion for her most recent pregnancy, viewing her ultrasound image did not dissuade her from future abortions. Carol, 43, white, carrying a cumulative pregnancy, viewed her ultrasound and had a different response. She experienced seeing the ultrasound and viewing the slow heartbeat as emotionally difficult as abortion rights supporters have continued. Carol discovered one day that she was quickly growing a mass in her uterus that was endangering her health. She sought treatment at the local hospital. She learned that she was pregnant and returned her ultrasound without her request. I said to the doctor, you can tell me if I'm pregnant. I need to know because I'm going to terminate the pregnancy. And he turned the screen around and said, right there's the fetus. Thump, thump, thump. You know. I could hear the heart beating, and I put my hands on my ears and I said, that's enough. This had negative emotional consequences for Cheryl. She explained, that gave me some psychological problems right there. Because then I knew there was a human life in there now. Still, I knew I didn't want to give birth to it. I couldn't. Viewing the ultrasound did not change Cheryl's mind about having an abortion, but it did exact an emotional toll. The unexpected. Not all respondents described experiences with ultrasound fell into the response category anticipated by abortion rights opponents and supporters. Some respondents had decidedly unexpected responses to ultrasound viewing, embracing the opportunity even if they felt no equivocation about their plan to terminate pregnancy. Joy, 28, Native American, considered viewing her ultrasound to be an important part of being a responsible abortion patient. She asked to see her ultrasound image unprompted. Explaining why, she said, I have an ultrasound so I can actually see it right there. And I actually have the imprinted on my mind. You know, I wanted to be completely aware as to what I was doing. She made it clear that she was committed to the importance of ultrasound viewing, despite the emotional difficulty it caused her. She continued, I think it's also kind of traumatizing, but it is what's occurring. I don't think there's any reason to pretend like it's not. Lisa, 23, white, too, felt it was important to view her ultrasound and advance her abortion. Part to honor the complexity of her choice and recognize the fetus inside her. I asked to see a picture because I needed, the healing thing, or not necessarily a healing thing, but I wanted to feel all the pain of what I was doing. But it's not about me. It's not my life. Although both of these women used language that framed ultrasound duty as causing some emotional difficulty, as abortion rights supporters have asserted, they sought this difficulty and did not find duty to matter. Contrary to the predictions of abortion rights opponents, they terminated their pregnancies despite viewing their ultrasound images. Jennifer, 27 white, had an even more unexpected response to the ultrasound. She experienced viewing as helping her be comfortable with her choice to terminate the pregnancy. She said, when she showed me the sonogram, it made me feel even better about my abortion. Echoing Mitchell's 2001, finding that ultrasound viewing can help women to feel that their pregnancy is more real, Jennifer reported positively that seeing her ultrasound made the pregnancy and abortion decision more real. I really liked it. I really liked it because it made it feel more real. The importance of adoption period. Although women made different decisions about whether or not to view their ultrasound, across respondents there is consensus that having the option to view one's ultrasound is a good thing, whether as a result of clinic policy or legal regulation. However, respondents emphasize that having the option to view it is not the same as mandatory viewing. No respondent felt that all women seeking abortion should have to view their ultrasound. Jesse, 18, Polynesian and Native American, insisted that it should be your choice whether you want to look at it or not. It is worth noting that some respondents were supportive of other regulations, including a mandatory 24-hour waiting period, but mandatory ultrasound viewing was unique and gained no support in the sample. Discussion. Our interviews uncovered an array of experiences with viewing ultrasound images among women undergoing abortion. Some expected and some unexpected. Even in our small sample, we did not have a singular experience of ultrasound viewing, nor did they report just the two responses predicted by the current political debate about ultrasound viewing. Namely, ultrasound viewing will discourage women from abortion, or that it will be emotionally difficult, but will not dissuade women from intending to terminate pregnancy. We also found widespread support for requiring clinics to offer women the opportunity to view these images, as long as women have the right to decline. The diversity of response points to the importance of understanding ultrasound viewing in the broader context of a woman's life. Amanda, for example, explained that, from the outset, she wanted to continue her pregnancy, and seeing the ultrasound cemented this commitment. The fact that her choice to carry her previously unwanted pregnancy to term did not preclude her from seeking abortion for her current pregnancy underscores the importance of understanding ultrasound viewing, the context, and the circumstances around these pregnancies. Ultrasound viewing does not have just one effect even on a particular woman. Although other studies have suggested that ultrasound viewing can serve as an abortion deterrent, Chandler in 2006, Piotrowski et al. In 2004, these studies do not include analysis of how the context of that viewing may influence women's interpretation of the ultrasound image. Given findings about how the narratives that accompany ultrasound viewings and wanted pregnancies matter, this is an important consideration. This study is limited by its small sample size, and these findings are not generalizable to the larger population of women seeking abortion. We note, in addition, that our findings may be limited because we recruited women at abortion facilities. Recruitment of women with unwanted pregnancies through different results. Recruitment of women with unwanted pregnancies through other means, e.g. at crisis pregnancy resource centers, might yield different results. Further, we did not explore objective differences in the actual ultrasound viewing, moving from static image, printout versus on-screen, with or without audio. Nonetheless, this preliminary study points to the importance of continued research on ultrasound viewing in the abortion context. Presently, its impact on women's decision-making around abortion is largely unknown. These data suggest that some of the current assumptions about viewing effects are inaccurate, but at least we report here on the experience of women who specifically chose to view their ultrasounds. We do not know more broadly what impact mandatory ultrasound viewing would have, although Cheryl's experience suggests that it could have a negative impact. Finally, this study began from the premise that women carrying unwanted pregnancies may have a different experience of ultrasound than those with wanted pregnancies. These data suggest some consistency. For example, the accounts from women such as Jennifer that seeing your ultrasound image helped to make the experience more real is similar to work on ultrasound in other contexts. Looking at an ultrasound, even for women who choose to abort, may feel like a natural part of the pregnancy process because our culture is full of images of women doing ultrasound. Future research should explore these questions. Implications for practice and policy. Recent pushes for regulations in abortion care, as well as their attendant opposition, have brought ultrasound practice into the controversy over abortion care. The legislation required abortion care facilities to inform women where they can receive a free ultrasound. The legislation mandated that all women seeking an abortion view their ultrasound and hear a description of the image. The debate about the use of ultrasound in abortion care is intensified. At home, 2012. And yet, these regulations are being forwarded without empirical study of the impact of ultrasound food in the abortion context. In this study, we saw.
May I inquire of you?
I yield the microphone to you.
Excellent. Thank you. You can take the notebook. We're going to switch. Okay. Hello. My name is Megan, and I'm a member of Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice, and I'm here to participate in the Women's Filibuster. Excuse me. Sonia, I'm going to need a cough drop. If you can find one. I'm going to read from... Oh, actually, I'm going to yield. Do I get an inquiry? You yield for an inquiry? Yes, I yield to an inquiry from my fellow Missourian, Erin. Come on over. Erin, you can tell the group here, take the mic, why you want to participate in the Women's Filibuster, and then we're going to start reading from articles of faith.
Okay. Well, my name's Erin, and I'm here to participate because I'm sick of politicians interfering in my personal medical decisions. So, the story that takes place in these pages begins and ends in the state of Missouri, where for a certain period at the close of the 1980s, reporters and photographers converged from many parts of the United States. There were some from other countries too, from Australia and Germany and Japan, with urgent, important questions about induced abortion and the protections guaranteed under law. At that time, I was a staff writer for the Washington Post, asked by my editors to produce a Sunday magazine article about the Supreme Court case that was drawing so much attention to Missouri. And as I prepared for my trip to St. Louis, I looked in libraries and bookstores for the background reading that would help me trace the modern American abortion conflict, which I assumed dated back 16 years to the famous January 1973 ruling called Roe v. Wade. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a great many things, as I was to discover, and one of them was the assumption that a rich assortment of written reference works would explain for me, in language not intended to persuade or demean, what had happened in the years of conflict over legalized abortion, what events had led Americans to react, as they did, to group as they did, and to settle with such ferocity into warring camps. The abortion shelf, I found dozens of books of argument, some of them shrill, some of them eloquent. I found religious theses, essay collections, sociological studies, and medical texts, but I could not find a single volume that told me in narrative fashion what I wanted to know, which I began to understand was at once simple and alarmingly complex. How did we come to this? Who were the partisans? What were the stories of women and men whose personal understanding of the events around them was so different that they had to come to describe these events in entirely different vocabulary? I have incurred many debts in the 6 years of work on this book, but none are as deep as my enduring obligation to the people inside and outside Missouri who listened to my explanation of what I wished to do and agreed to help, giving generously of their time in interviews, making available personal correspondence and private memoranda, rooting through attics and basements for file folders and scrapbooks that had lain undisturbed for 10 or 20 years, all the while keeping to themselves what must have been real misgivings about the nature of the enterprise. I tried to describe my intentions the same way at the outset of each of the 500 interviews that took place for this book. I hope to write a history set largely within a single state and told them from the perspective of people on both sides of what I came to regard as the crucial 2 decades of the American abortion conflict, the period of extraordinary change that began in the late 1960s with the first state efforts to modify old criminal abortion statutes. I suppose that in Missouri I would find guides into a drama that has unfolded in similar fashion in every state in the country. What I had not anticipated was the power, conscience, and personal sacrifice in the story these guides had to tell. Nor had I anticipated the candor with which so many of them would tell it, all the while knowing that their listener was collecting parallel stories from the enemy camp. My greatest thanks go to Judith Whitcomb and Samuel Lee, whose patience and good humor withstood scores of lengthy interviews and telephone conversations, and to the unfailingly friendly and helpful members of their families. I owe a different kind of thanks to new friends from St. Louis, to Etta and Ted Taylor, who welcomed me into their home as a house guest, offering lodgings, wonderful company, and the best food I've ever eaten in my life. Colleagues kept me going. A triple measure of gratitude is due to two. John Carroll hauled me through the difficult spots chapter by chapter, and Bob Thompson, the Washington Post editor who first sent me to Missouri, kept reading abortion narrative and providing wise editorial advice long after his magazine duties were over. To my family, my parents, my brothers, my children, Aaron and Joanna, and my heroic husband, Bill, my thanks and my love, you carried me all the way here, Cynthia Gordy, July 1997. Chapter 1, Code. What happened in Sedalia was not a thing that Robert Dumler talked about, not the place or the smell or the low-sick feeling that came to his stomach when he thought about it afterward. Doctors see things they wish they had not seen. He understood that about being a doctor, and Robert Dumler was a quiet man who delivered babies for a living at a big Catholic hospital where they were cordial to him, even though he belonged to the United Church of Christ. The hospital was outside St. Louis, which people like to call a Catholic city, as though the great domed cathedral somehow spanned the length and breadth of the city limits. And when Dumler was at work, there were nurses in nuns' habits who bustled briskly down the corridors and nodded to him in their deferential nurse's way. Good morning, doctor. Among the obstetrical nurses in the hospital was a big, smart, opinionated woman named Judith Whitcomb, and sometimes after deliveries, Dumler and Whitcomb would lean against a wall in their scrubs and watch the commotion around them and talk. Dumler was in his 30s then, but he was older than she was, and it amused him to see Judy Whitcomb irritate the senior physicians by pointing out when and where she thought they had bungled their work. She had no concept of deference. She thought some of the older nurses had used themselves up and should be let go, and she thought a hospital cheated its nurses by forcing them to take unpaid after-shift time to prepare the next crew, and she would say these things in a resonant way that carried through the halls of the hospital. Judy Whitcomb would say casually to Dumler, not looking at him, I bet she doesn't really want that kid. Maybe not, Dumler would say, and they would talk about something else. But he understood that Whitcomb, who was not a nun, and who apparently was not a Roman Catholic either, was signaling him. There was a code at work, and Dumler was not sure what it was, but he knew that he was in on it somehow, and that it had to do with the ideas that might be dangerous, even for the undiplomatic to discuss in a public place. After a while, when no one else was listening, he told her what had happened in Sedalia. He was in the Air Force, a young Air Force doctor, and in 1962 he was dispatched to Central Missouri to serve on the base of Sedalia. He was the first obstetrician the base had ever had, and every morning he would get up in his military housing and go over to the little Air Force hospital to examine patients. Sometimes they would call him in the middle of the night, and he would switch on the light and fumble into his trousers and go out the door in the unsteady gait of a man working hard to mimic alertness. That was when this call came in the middle of the night, and when Dumler walked into the emergency room, what he saw in more places than he would have thought possible was blood. There was blood on the walls, there was blood on the floor, there was blood on the gurney and on the towels and on the hands and arms of the emergency crew, who were silent now and no longer moving rapidly. Beneath them lay a woman whose skin had gone pallid and slack, and when Dumler lifted her legs into the stirrups and cleaned some of the blood away, he saw that someone had pushed inside her vagina with a sharp instrument and aimed it toward the cervix and thrust straight up. The blood vessels to either side of the cervix had emptied all over the Air Force emergency room, and the car in which this woman's husband had driven her 20 miles, which was the distance between the hospital and the abortionist. The husband told Dumler they had 5 children already. 5 children already. Dunmore remembered that for a long time afterward, he was no longer able to summon up the husband's height, the color of his hair, or anything, except the flat, bewildered look on his face as his wife was pronounced dead on the examining table. Expired was what Dunmore wrote in his precise decisions notation. Nobody ever told him why they could not have 6 children, or what kind of a person she might have been when she was alive in the house with the 5 they had. He had learned in medical school that you pull down the shade when you have to, that you cannot climb into the life of every patient and still show up for work in the morning, but after it was over, he would think about Sedalia and the words stupid would press up inside him. It was a stupid death. When he was a resident 2 years before the Air Force, an older doctor had asked him to assist, and Dunmore had stood there and handed over the cervical dilators while the older doctor cleaned out a woman's uterus under general anesthesia in the sterile operating room. The older doctor told him that the patient was a nice young woman whose boyfriend had come from a family of high social standing, and that they had all invented a plausible diagnosis requiring termination of pregnancy to save her life. Dunmore understood that his job was to hold the dilators and shut up, but when he thought about Sedalia, he always thought about this other woman, also the one with the fancy boyfriend. So he had told Judy Whitcomb that story too. Then she knew she had been right about Bob Dunmore, and she came to him one day and said, "Listen, there's a group of us and we are doing something illegal. We need your help." In 1968, the year Judith Whitcomb began recruiting medical doctors into a conspiracy to commit repeated felonies in the state of Missouri. 20 years old and lived in a modestly proportioned pea green house with her 2 sons and her husband Arthur, who ran the St. Louis Post-Dispatch delivery route. At that time, Judy had 3 different occupations, each of which interested her deeply and made her feel useful in the world. From morning until early afternoon, she cared for children, her own 2 sons and various children of neighbors who needed part-time babysitting from early afternoon until 11 o'clock at night. She worked the hospital swing shift in labor and delivery, attending to patients and supervising less experienced nurses. And one evening each week, she stayed home with her husband to answer telephone calls from people who were threatening to commit suicide. The telephone answering work was a volunteer job and was sometimes very difficult, but Judy liked it and worked very hard at it, especially during the early months when she was first trying to accustom herself to the distraught voices on the other end of the line. She was a tall, broad-boned woman who thought of herself as forthright, perhaps tactless on occasion, but not exceptionally brave or imaginative. Since childhood, she had felt that she was overweight, which made her self-conscious about her appearance. Although she had blue eyes and strong arms and light brown hair, which she wore back, and her husband Art thought her smile was beautiful. Art was by nature shyer than Judy, and he loved listening to Judy's singing voice, which was so strong and clear that she often invited to sing alone at weddings, or to solo for the Methodist Church choir. Before the time at which this story commences, in fact, Judy and Arthur Whitcomb had lived rather quietly and conventionally in suburban St. Louis, and their attentions divided among the competing demands of work, neighbors, church, and family. Their home was decorated with early American furniture and stood 1 mowed lawn from the house where Art Whitcomb had grown up, so that Judy could walk outside and see the white lace curtains of her mother-in-law's kitchen window. There was a barbecue and maple tree with branches thick enough to hold the scrapwood tree house, and when the neighborhood children were underfoot, Judy would go into the kitchen and make caramel popcorn or chocolate chip cookies or donuts she fried in a deep steel pan. The minister from church liked visiting their Whitcomb house because it seemed to him that Judy propped the front door open and invited in any local friends who happened by. In the wintertime, I remember the house had a wood fire smell because she kept the fireplace going, recalls the minister, whose name was Kent Gottman. She more or less held open house. She kept the coffee pot on. She was a caretaker. She liked being regarded as a caretaker. Judy sometimes thought she was such a capable nurse because she had found a job that obliged her to spend her working hours ministering to people who needed her. When she was a child, or on her father's arm in Indiana, Judy had tended to her baby brother while her mother disappeared into farm chores. When the family moved to St. Louis after Judy's father had sold the farm and become a traveling salesman, Judy still kept a motherly watch over her brother, and although she thought for a while that she might try to become a professional singer, she left St. Louis after high school to enroll at Texas Christian University, which had offered her a voice scholarship. It took Judy only 1 semester at Texas Christian to switch to the University School of Nursing, where she felt comfortable at once and excelled in her studies. She was good at the science. She liked the feeling of confidence that swelled up in her when she put on her uniform. She transferred back to a more accelerated nursing program at a hospital in St. Louis and graduated with honors. The hospital gave Judy an achievement award for pediatric nursing and asked her to stay on and teach. When her second son was born in 1965, Judy tried to retire so she could care for both her children full time. But without her nursing work, she felt restless and incomplete, and after a while, she reported back to the hospital, pretending the family finances were forcing her to work. But she understood that the money was a kind of excuse for something she wanted to do anyway. She liked balancing her family life with her nursing shifts, and she also began volunteering regularly at church, where the young Reverend Gottman was trying to update the youth fellowship program. By 1968, Judy was one of the Kirkwood United Methodist Church's principal youth counselors, leading Sunday discussion groups and occasional church retreats. And when Gottman decided to add a sex education course, Judy offered to help the minister look for suitable pamphlets and educational films. She placed an inquiring telephone call one day to what she had been told was the Social Health Association, but she reached instead the administrative office of the new St. Louis telephone counseling service called Suicide Prevention. "You're calling the wrong place," said the Suicide Prevention Director, a psychologist named Gwendolyn Harvey, after Julie explained what she was looking for. "But while I have you on the telephone, we're recruiting volunteers too." And that was how Judy came to know Gwen Harvey and to volunteer one evening a week for suicide prevention. She completed the obligatory training in a crisis intervention, which Judy could see required a special delicacy and alertness when the personal contact was only by voice, and eventually during Judy's shift, all St. Louis suicide prevention calls were routed to a special telephone on the Whitcomb's back porch. Judy could close the door to this porch, shutting out the noise from the main part of the house. The telephone sat on a plain wood desk. The calls would begin after dinner as the boys were being tucked away into their rooms. And when Judy heard the porch telephone ring, she was always frightened at first about what she might hear when she picked up the receiver. Sobbing or slow, thick threats, or once in a while a man declaring that he had a gun in his hands as they spoke. Judy would press the receiver to her ear and try to work with the voice on the other end. "What's been happening? That sounds awful. You must feel very lonely. Try to draw the person out. Give him someone to talk to." Art would look in on her from time to time so that Judy could signal him when she thought she needed to use the regular telephone to make an emergency call to a psychiatrist, or have the telephone company start a trace so the police could intervene. But more often, Judy was able to talk the callers through their panic and convince them to go for help themselves. She was very good at it. She liked sitting out there on the porch at night with their breakfast table and their squishy plaid couch outside in the garden. Beyond the screen porch windows, the shadowed bulk of the big maple tree. All of this surrounded her and made her feel embraced while Judy held the telephone receiver and led her caller carefully away from harm, just as she might do in the hospital wards. A patient needed something, and Judy was able to give it to them directly. Counsel, comfort, like medications in the IV line. Then, as the suicide prevention service was publicized and the telephone number passed from one service agency to another, pregnant women began to call the number too. But the pregnant women were not suicidal, not the way the other callers were. They were direct. They would say to Judy, "This is a telephone number for desperate people, right? Then fine, I'm desperate. I want an abortion." Sometimes they would add, as though in deference to the name before the telephone listing, as though this might produce otherwise unavailable information. "If I don't get an abortion, I will kill myself." And Judy didn't know what to say. She was a registered nurse in the state of Missouri, and she knew a very great deal about the human body and American medical procedure. She knew how to operate complicated machinery and how to pound a dying person's chest to make a heart start beating again, and how to irrigate bowels and press the hypodermic needle into human flesh and put a tube down an unconscious person's throat. She knew how to monitor the heartbeat lines on a stethoscope during labor, how to feel for a prolapsed umbilical cord, and how to select without guidance the proper surgical clamps for controlling heavy bleeding during a cesarean section. But she didn't know where a pregnant woman could get an abortion. "Call your doctor," Judy said to the first of the suicide prevention callers, feeling foolish as she said it. If their doctors had been able to get these women abortions, the women would not have been calling suicide prevention. Judy had never had occasion to open the Missouri statute book and read the paragraphs under Section 559, where the crime of abortion was described as felony manslaughter. But she knew that it was illegal and that in the hospital where she worked, it was also unspeakable. This was a word that no one repeated aloud unless it was a part of the medical terminology for what lay people think of as miscarriage, spontaneous abortion. A chart in the obstetrics and gynecology wing of Judy's hospital might read, but that was all. Nobody talked about it, Judy Whitcomb recalls. In retrospect, I know that through the years there were women who come in for diagnostic D&Cs who were really pregnant, but nobody talked about it. Gwen Harvey told Judy that the other suicide prevention volunteers were reporting abortion callers too, that apparently the telephone number was being passed along as a last resort resource, even though nobody at suicide prevention had any useful information at all. And at one time, Gwen had known a gynecological resident who told vivid stories about women being wheeled into the emergency room after illegal abortions. But all Gwen remembered from those stories were the descriptions of lacerations and puncture wounds and infections and uncontrolled bleeding. She had no idea where the women had gone for their abortions or what kind of instruments had been used on them, or whether it was possible in a Midwestern state at the close of the 1960s to obtain an abortion that was clean and safe. Suicidology had become a modern field of study, and Gwen had bulging files and reprints about the care of persons who were threatening to kill themselves. But when she listened to the detailed accounts of the pregnant women's telephone calls, it seemed to her that most of these women were not really looking for crisis intervention as to a referral to a psychologist for extended treatment. What they wanted was something more practical than that. What they wanted, as far as Gwen Harvey could see, was an abortionist. A roster of terrible specificity accumulated in the years leading up to the late 1960s and was committed to print in the journals of American medicine. This was what she did it with. The examining physicians must have murmured to each other as the bedside curtains were drawn. This was found in the cervix or identified in the bloodstream. Sometimes a woman could be persuaded to describe the device she had pushed inside herself, or could be persuaded to describe the device or the fluid she had drunk, or the particular tool she believed the abortionist had used. Sometimes the doctors could look inside the vaginal area or open an abdomen at autopsy and recognize the markers left behind. Air pumped into the uterus left the large blood vessels distended. Turpentine, when ingested, was introduced by douche, gave the urine an odor reminiscent of violence. Potassium tablets pushed into the vagina to stimulate bleeding that left craters of corroded tissue along the vaginal walls. At Kansas City General Hospital, where a doctor named Samuel Montello was called, while he saw establishing his private practice in the 1950s, he learned to recognize the tiny indentations that could be seen through the speculum, cervical bruises still fresh where metal instruments had been stamped. A generation earlier, the popular press had made elliptical reference when scandal or police raid appeared to demand it to an illegal operation. But the medical journals were blunt in their clinical reports. The precision of these numbers was to a certain extent illusionary. As late as the 1960s, sporadic regional studies notwithstanding, there was no practical way to accumulate genuinely accurate documentation on the annual number of women who deliberately ended their own pregnancies or tried to. For some years, the figure of 681,600 was repeated from time to time. This was a statistic first printed in 1936 by a St. Louis gynecology professor named Frederick J. Taussig, whose lengthy book about abortion was for 2 decades the only serious abortion reference work on the shelves. Taussig spent 5 full pages explaining his calculations, which were extrapolated from 4 regional surveys and adjusted for what he supposed was the difference between rural and urban women. Then, with his equations laid out like schoolwork arithmetic, he presented his numbers: 681,600 abortions induced annually in the United States and directly attributable to these abortions. Taussig asserted 8,179 deaths. As estimates, these might have been reasonable or unreasonable. The desire to avoid any public record of an event that is so often tied up with the moral life of the individual is found The same lack of honesty appears in our mortality records, where we find cases of abortion death registered as pneumonia, kidney disease, or heart failure. Because it was illegal and because it could be made to look like something that was not illegal, the practice of abortion defied standard accounting even for those aborted women who did turn up at reputable medical centers, which many, probably most, did not. If a woman was brought to a hospital emergency room with a bleeding vagina and none of the evident markers, even the most diligent record keeper might elect to register the admission under spontaneous abortion or some other category that does not contain the words criminal abortion. The Kansas University Medical Center survey, for example, which according to its author encompassed every abortion, listed fewer than 1/10 of these as probable criminal abortions. Other categories of explanation included traumatic falls, blighted ova, premature separation of the placenta, with the largest category by far covering 657 of the survey's 927 cases was unknown. Women had ended their pregnancies at the hospital, in other words, but no one ever wrote a reason into the charts. By 1955, when the Planned Parenthood Federation of America medical director, Mary Calderon, convened a national conference whose proceedings would be published as the first major American post-toxic abortion reference book, the conference participants' estimates of illegal abortions in this country ranged from 200,000 to 1.3 million per year. The deaths from abortion tables were similarly blurred, although it was widely agreed that the introduction of strong antibiotics had provided physicians with an effective weapon against the internal infections that had killed many women of Tausig's era. And one believed Tausig's 1936 death rate, which some doctors thought were so inflated as to be fanciful even for that pre-antibiotic era, illegal abortions looked on paper to be considerably safer 20 years later. National Center for Health Statistics figures for the late 1950s, limited though they surely still were by the inadequacies of abortion reporting, listed fewer than 300 deaths per year in the category that included illegal abortions. Abortion is no longer a dangerous procedure, Calderon wrote in 1960, summing the proceedings of her conference in the American Journal of Public Health. One can say only 260 deaths from all types of abortions, that is a low mortality rate. Then rhetorically, preparing to answer her own question, why should illegal abortion be a public health problem? Dr. Mary Calderon, who at the time of that writing had spent 7 years with Planned Parenthood, was probably more responsible than any other American medical figure of her era for urging the subject of induced abortion in the lexicon of modern-day public health. She was a strong-minded woman of what in later years might have been called intense feminist inclinations, and she had declared from the onset of her tenure that she intended to address illegal abortions as directly and strategically as a public health official might address a broad-scale contagious illness. I've begun to think of abortion as a preventable disease, Calderon wrote to a colleague in 1954, with an epidemiology quite similar in many respects to that of tuberculosis. The venereal disease experts had taught them all something about pulling a scandalous illness into the serious arena of public health, Calderon wrote, and she mentioned a friend chiding her for the birth control community's reluctance to look squarely at illegal abortion and its effects on the population at large. You people in Planned Parenthood are where the tuberculosis people were about 30 years ago. You're still trying to cure the disease by using clinical individual application instead of by using public health methods. Calderon wrote that her friend had said, to which I say, amen. The very notion of a national conference was sufficiently alarming in 1955 that the participants were anxious that the press not get wind of it beforehand. The only precedent for such a formal and quasi-public abortion discussion had come more than a decade earlier when the National Committee on Maternal Health had sponsored a 1942 conference that included studies of spontaneous abortion or miscarriage, and still made the organizers so nervous that they refused at the time to tell inquiring newspaper reporters who would participate at what papers would be presented. It was the word that panicked people, abortion, abortionists. For many years, Planned Parenthood and its organizational precursors had gone to considerable effort publicly to disassociate abortion from birth control, which during the early days of the contraception campaigns was considered inflammatory enough on its own merits. The Calderon archive includes an undated draft of an early Planned Parenthood brochure in which the caption, "Abortion is the wrong way to limit family size," is accompanied by a drawing that someone had nixed as not desperate looking enough. Gal depicted looks much too detached, reads the handwritten note. Artist promises revise, so she is anguished but still attractive. I want her walking on the street glancing fearfully off-right as if being watched. Thus, Calderon's 1955 abortion conference was in itself a kind of declaration of intent, a gathering of men and women and worthy institutions attached to their names, all of them soberly discussing into microphones the problem of induced abortion in the United States. Problem was a word that appeared frequently in the published transcript. Tragic problem, basic problem. It was a problem because nobody could obtain respectable data. It was a problem because illegal abortion made a lot of women sick. It was a problem because there were urban public hospitals like Philadelphia General and Los Angeles County in which entire wards had been ceded to patients trying to recover from illegal abortion. At Los Angeles County on any given afternoon during the late 1950s and early 1960s, 50 to 100 patients at a time were separated off into what the doctors referred to as infected OB. Every one of these wards over the years leading into the mid-1960s produced physicians whose personal encounters with criminal abortion complications were to haunt them for many years afterward. Infected OB is what they called it, but it was mostly infected abortions, recalls Gail Anderson, the Los Angeles medical professor who was hired in 1958 as head physician. It looked like a set of intensive care units all full of abortion patients. If you can imagine walking into a room where there's anywhere from 5 to 10 patients all attached to tubes or whatever, many times they were jaundiced from infections. You've got foul-smelling stuff coming from their uteruses. You've got shock, and in some cases you would have patients in congestive heart failure. They died of congestive heart failure, foaming into the mouth. Gail Anderson walked the infected OB ward every working day of his tenure at the country's obstetrical and gynecological service, and when he took over the hospital's emergency medicine department, and people wondered how an OB/GYN man could switch so seamlessly to trauma, he would always say, well, if you had been where I have for the last 13 years, you wouldn't need to ask. And around the country, there were other physicians like Gail Anderson, doctors who had seen enough abortion patients to accumulate detailed casualty accountings of their own. Ira Gersley, an OB/GYN who joined the staff of Philadelphia General Hospital in 1956, used to recite this list when people asked him about complications from illegal abortion. He tried to care for one patient who was delivered to the hospital with no pulse. Gersley would say, but who received for a while and was lucid long enough to plead with him aloud after he took out her uterus and tried to sew her back together. She said, "Doctor, help me, I'm dying," and I knew it. Gersley recalls, there was nothing more I could do, and I never made it back to her room. That was the abortion story that appeared to have settled into Gersley's memory. He treated scores of infected abortion patients, he would recall in later years, but this one young woman was so lovely, and he worked on her for 6 hours straight, and she died. When Gersley told that story, it was as though the great sorry array of infected OB disasters had compressed themselves into a single hospital, as though the image of this one young woman's collapsing organs was enough to make any sensible person wonder at the wisdom of criminalizing abortion. In this way, during the first decade after Mary Calderon's abortion conference, the Philadelphia doctor was like many physicians who never worked in an abortion ward but were haunted nonetheless. By the 1960s, every state in the country harbored at least a scattering of doctors who had come to believe that something was wrong with American abortion law.
Fellow Missourian, I'd like to make an inquiry.
Yes, you.
Would you like to yield the microphone?
I would like to yield the microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, there you. Oh, I thought you had your. Okay. I'm Eileen Stites. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Planned Parenthood of Kansas and Mid-Missouri, and I support women's rights to education and reproductive health. I'm going to continue reading from where my colleague here left off. While the men in the legislature pushed pieces of paper around hearing room tables, she knew there were women in the Capitol, but a great hush appeared to have fallen over their small and far-flung voices. Judy would have come to pregnant women into her house and brought them to the back bedroom to finish out their abortion. It was 1970, the very early part of the year, and the law had changed a little in the places that appeared eager to discourage as many potential abortion patients as possible. The North Carolina law required women to prove that they were residents of the state.
Colorado hospitals were turning down far more women than they accepted. Kansas had approved its model penal code legislation, but the law was not yet in effect. A woman could fly to California if she had the plane fare and the hotel fare and the abortion money and the names of 2 doctors who would interview her to decide whether she was mentally ill or poised to become mentally ill, or willing to pay them to declare for the record that continuance of the pregnancy, as the California law put it, would gravely impair the physical or mental health of the mother. If she had a tremendous amount of money and a current passport, a woman could sit on airplanes for many hours and then be ferried by a foreign taxi driver to a legal abortion doctor in London or Tokyo, an option that appeared from St. Louis to be about as practical as reporting to a clinic on the moon. The women who called the Clergy Consultation Service of Missouri during the early months when the telephone number was passed by sympathetic doctors and college campus word of mouth were not going to apply for passports in order to end their pregnancies. The number rang at the Whitcomb house, on the line in the back, on the porch. Clergy Consultation Service, Judy would say in her nurse's voice, musical and brisk at the same time. Waiting. In the evenings, Judy was away working labor and delivery at the hospital, and during those hours, Art Whitcomb would answer the porch telephone for her. His opening lines rehearsed until he could repeat them comfortably and with some measure of Judy's assurance. Yes, we can direct you to someone who will counsel you about abortion. No, we cannot give you the name of an abortionist. That was the rule, the Howard Moody model. Counsel only in person, minister to parishioner, or the district attorneys will be least enthusiastic about wading in to make trouble. Here's the minister on duty in your area, Judy or Art Whitcomb would say, and then a while later, the telephone would ring at the chapel office of the Reverend Ken Gottman in Kirkwood, or the Reverend Tom Raver in Springfield, or one of the other ministers and counselors Judy and Dwight Harvey had coaxed into service. The ministers had the name of the abortionist. It was a short list at first, and not entirely satisfactory. Martha Vineyard did reliable instrumental dilation and curettage, which meant that she supervised the full procedure, but she charged a minimum of $600. There were abortionists in town who did a reasonably sterile job of packing the insertion of a gauze irritant into the cervix. But a woman who had been packed had to leave and wait for the miscarriage somewhere else. It was cheaper and quicker to send the women to Mexico, where cleancasts in the border towns in the capital stayed open by bribing the appropriate authorities. Or to Chicago, where Judy was developing a business-like relationship with the young abortionist she came to think of as the Corman. The Corman's abortions were illegal, but so were nearly everybody else's. And he had built his reputation doing abortions for the undergrounds in Chicago. First, the Service, the clandestine abortion network run by women who all used the pseudonym Jane. And then the Chicago branch of the Clergy Consultation Service. Chicago's clergy service was managed by the Reverend E. Spencer Parsons, the American Baptist minister who was serving as dean of Rockefeller Memorial Chapel at the University of Chicago. And after he met the foreman, Parsons confidently added the man's name to the national network's roster of competent Chicago abortionists. Very trim, fine-looking guy, Parsons recalls in his first encounter with the foreman in 1967, when a local physician brought the abortionist to campus to present him personally to Parsons and vouch for his qualifications. I could see why people were impressed. The question was, how come this guy's doing this? What background does he have in this? He gave out that he was an Army medical corpsman and he'd been doing these in Korea. None of this was true, as it turned out. Many months later, the corpsman told Parsons he had never served in the medical corps at all, and that he had learned this technique from the physician who accompanied him to Parsons' chapel office. But it looked to Parsons as though he had learned it very well, and by the time the man changed his story, Parsons no longer cared what his history was. Women came back from corpsman abortions with high recommendations. He ran an efficient operation along the lines of a tiny bookmaking unit, with a woman to answer the telephone and a tough little driver who told people his name was Jimmy. As a rule, Judy Whitcomb did not pay much attention to automobiles, but when she made her trip to Chicago to serve the foreman's procedure, it struck her that Jimmy was chauffeuring what looked like a mafia car, some big dark American model that he drove her around in for a long time, until she was thoroughly lost, which was plainly Jimmy's intent. He had picked Judy up in a prearranged Chicago hotel, and when he finally dropped her off, they were somewhere in the big city. Judy had no idea where, ascending the elevator in a massive apartment complex to the unmarked door of a two-bedroom apartment. The living room had been rearranged enough to look like a waiting area, and in the bedrooms, the foreman kept medical tables foldable for sudden rapid visitation. Judy watched him for an afternoon, the women knocking one by one on the plain apartment door, the female assistant showing them where to undress and lie down on their backs, the foreman bending over them, and his white jacket with the surgical instruments clicking quietly against each other. He used no anesthetic, and the women would grimace with blanching pain while he talked to them. Gently, Judy thought, and actually rather oddly for a medical man. She had attended at many hospital D&C procedures, but the patients were usually draped and knocked out by drugs, so that even the kindest doctors sometimes told jokes or chatted about their weekends over the women's left forms. It was interesting to watch a doctory person work alone. Women he had to listen to, Judy thought, and when the foreman's day was finished, she was satisfied with what she had seen. He was good, he was courteous, he used sterile techniques. He knew what he was doing. It was the local abortionists Judy had to back up, the ones who wedged gauze into the women's vaginas and then sent them away to abort. Most of these women went home or were taken in by friends while they waited for the bleeding to start. Some would call the back porch telephone number and say, "Please, come get me. I can't go home now." So Art or Judy would climb into the station wagon and go out to find them. Pale young women standing out on street corners with their purses under their arms and the cotton gauze pushed up inside them. When Art tried to remember how these women looked a long time later, he could not quite bring their faces into focus. They seemed to him very young, really girls more than women. And what came to his mind was the back bedroom where the women would lie in the Whitcomb's spare bed and abort. He remembered that their hands would reach up behind them over their heads, and that they would grab hold of the headboard, crying out while it was happening, and that if Judy were away at the hospital, Art would try to think of what he might say or do that would give comfort. Most of the time, he would tell them that it was going to be all right. He would just stand there saying it over and over until it seemed as though things were coming to a peak. Then the bleeding might surge, the woman might have a pushing feeling, and Art would show her the spare toilet, where he and Judy had fixed a plastic basin inside the bowl. If they had timed it right, the basin could catch the abortion, the blood and the fetus together, then Art would put some newspaper over it, so the woman did not have to look at it, and lift the basin into the bathtub for Judy to examine when he got home. After a while, Art learned how to study the contents of the basin himself. Judy showed him how important this was to make sure that nothing had been left inside to set off infection. And when the women were back in bed, he would go over to the bathtub and raise the newspaper and look, knowing he was supposed to find 2 arms, 2 legs, fine. He was relieved when he found it all in the pan. Sometimes he wondered why it didn't bother him very much. The blood in the feet the size of rice grains and the fragile pale splinters he could see were beginning of bones. Art could throw up just like that if he happened to see someone else get sick nearby, but sifting the contents of a stranger's abortion pan never made his stomach heave. The way he looked at it, he was helping, he was a lifeline. A girl was reclaiming the future, and he was one of the people holding her hand while she did it. He would call Judy out of the hospital and give her the report. "It's complete," or "I can't find it all." And Judy would tell him over the telephone what he might have to do. Monitor her temperature, massage the abdomen, see if anything else comes out. Judy took these calls at the nurse's station, keeping her voice low and turning her back to the other nurses. And when she believed Art had the situation under control, she would hang up the telephone and go back to work. At the hospital, only the obstetrician, Robert Dubler, and a few others knew what she was doing, working labor and delivery in a Catholic obstetrical ward while shuttling women to and from abortionists. And when Judy stood in the hospital delivery room and watched the doctor place one large gloved hand around the emerging head of the baby, She would check herself sometimes to see if she could still summon the throat-tightening exhilaration that had made her love obstetrics in nursing school. We are helping a woman push a human being out into the world. This was the work she wanted to do. And when she thought about it now, she found that potential was a word she was repeating to herself. What landed in the plastic basin in the Whitcomb's back toilet was a potential human being, the premonition of a human being, the first rough arrangement of eyelids and fingerprints and human skin. The actual human being was the woman making her way out of the bathroom to lie back down on the bed. There was a story attached to every one of those women, and it seemed to Judy that the words they mouthed as they lay on their backs were the same words she heard at the bedside of the hospital obstetrics floor. You're a nurse. Help me through this. I can't do it by myself. The words were the same and the work was the same. Judy scrubbed, she soothed, she laid a palm on the forehead, she checked for complications. When she was a teenager, working as a hospital volunteer, she'd watched a woman hemorrhage to death after an illegal abortion. In later years, it would make a suitable story. The shouting ambulance crew, the hospital doctors pounding at the woman's chest, the damp blonde hair splayed out across the gurney. But the truth was that Judy didn't walk around afterward brooding about abortion, the law, and the nature of medical treatment. It was part of the hospital drama, and she put it in the back of her mind. In nursing school, she never saw an abortion complication unless they had disguised one and labeled it as something else. Judy's mother never talked about it. Her supervisors never talked about it. She believed in God, but could see no evidence, in or out of church, that God in His specific plan ever worked out these precise rules for women He got pregnant by mistake. In St. Louis, the 1962 Sherry Pinkfine articles ran in both newspapers, the Post-Dispatch and the Globe-Democrat. And Judy read them in her dining room with her first son, baby lurching around the legs of the table. She loved that boy in ways she had not understood the human heart could manage. But when she read the Pinkfine article, she had a hard time even grasping the terms of the debate. Of course Sherry Pinkfine should be able to have her abortion. They were two different things, a fetus and a baby. And it was a terrible story because a terrible thing had happened to Sherry Pinkfine, to the living person, to the woman, to the mother of children already born. This was women's business, and if you were a nurse, you took care of women. For that was how Judy thought of her work in labor and delivery, the care of women. You did what they needed you to do. You helped them have the baby or not have the baby. They came to you in crisis, and you eased them to the next place. Either way, it was a kind of delivery, and her own minister was helping arrange the abortions. From the porch phone to the reverend to the abortionist, an obligatory pause for contemplation. That was as unsullied a moral passage as Judy Whitcomb could manage. And on Sunday, she stood in the church choir, her conscience in peace, and let her good voice soar. My object would not be to rush, but to reassure, recalls the Reverend Ken Gottman, who was the third pastor down at the Kirkwood United Methodist Church when Judy Whitcomb recruited him as a clergy consultation service and abortion counselor. I would say to the woman, what do you think? How do you feel about it? I would say, I don't know how God feels about it. I can tell you what the Bible says about it, which is nothing. I would say, the churches are in various stages of agreement or disagreement about the issue. It's very convoluted. We're all just sort of feeling our way. I might say, I can cite you a biblical passage to support whichever point of view you're leaning toward. Ken Gottman was a young minister when Judy Whitcomb met him, 25 years old and chafing. He had straight brown hair that came a little over his ears, and he would have grown a beard if his chin hair hadn't been so spotty. The Kirkwood United Methodist Church hired him in 1968 into a proper-sounding position, Director of Program Development and Delivery. But Gottman liked to think that somewhere inside his inoffensive presence lurked the kind of bearded Christian radical who mobilized rent strikes downtown. He worried about his pastoral obligations to the poor. He marched against the war in Vietnam. The world seemed a place of furious turmoil at the close of the 1960s, and when Judy Whitcomb asked Gottman to join the clergy service, he said yes immediately. This was direct. It was virtuous. It had the feel of engagement. It was also a violation of the Missouri Criminal Code by the most prudent legal analyses, and Gottman grew frightened as Judy and Gwen Harvey added his name to the minister's list. He believed in civil disobedience when circumstances called for defiance of the unjust law, but he was not certain that his congregation would believe it at his side. And anyway, Gottman was not being asked to go limp in the arms of an arresting officer or provoke a confrontation by performing an abortion in public. All he was supposed to do, in the phrasing of the Missouri statute, was advise. Once a week or so, when the calls came over from Art and Judy Whitcomb's house, Gottman was able to walk down to the Unitarian Chapel in Kirkwood during the late afternoon, let himself into the deserted offices, and wait for the women who showed up to talk. He was to listen, to counsel, to describe the difference between a D&C and a Kaplan procedure. If they wanted to go through with it, he was to give them an abortionist's name and the instructions. Telephone here, drive here, meet him here, clean yourself with betadine antiseptic, 5 sanitary pads before you go. When they asked, some of them didn't. As it turned out, some of them appeared never to have tripped over an ethical quandary in their lives, but some would look at him a certain way, so that he could see the uneasiness gathering around their eyes. He was to assume his collar as best he could, and talk to them about induced abortion and God. So Gottman had to work out what he thought about this, about induced abortion and God. Among the clergy servants and ministers around the country, an improvised theology had arisen during the last 3 years of the 1960s, suggesting the ways a woman's visit to an abortionist might be reconciled with Christian and Jewish teachings. Life is a continuum. We are called upon to cherish it, but not to understand the precise moment of its beginnings. The Bible offers us guidance but no instructions. All is contextual. The word abortion does not appear in the Old Testament or the New Testament. Instead, we are given Scripture, a wondrous tapestry in which faith, human freedom, and moral responsibility are interwoven in patterns that God helps each of us to understand, together and alone. For those making their own decision to seek an abortion, I would do whatever I could to assist them, and I would do it in the name of Jesus Christ, who came that men might have the promise of life, life abundant. Preached the Reverend J. Claude Evans, the Southern Methodist University chaplain who ran the clergy consultation service in Dallas. From the university chapter pulpit on a Sunday morning, this is what the Reverend Evans said. Unwanted pregnancies happen to the good girls, not to the bad girls. The promiscuous girls, the ones who sleep around with all the campus studs, they're worldly wives, they know what to do. Even when they get pregnant, they don't show up at my office, they know what to do. It is the innocent I'm concerned about, the girls who didn't plan to go to bed, and who therefore took no precautions, who get in trouble. Countless recent studies verify this. So I had to ask myself, Claude, what would you have done if that one daughter of yours, the apple of your eye, had she gotten pregnant? One day I really thought this through, not only rationally and abstractly, but emotionally. I pictured Peachy coming in to see me with her tears and her agony. I saw her through the streams of tears on other young faces I had counseled. I saw myself through many a parent of real, live SMU students. Some who acquitted themselves magnificently when confronted with the daughter's pregnancy, and others who had failed their daughters, at least at first, until they had worked through their own fears and hang-ups. At last I began to see why the life of the girl is more important than the potential life in a bit of protoplasm. I felt the weight of an agonizing choice between evils, but I saw clearly what I would have done. Had my daughter found herself pregnant, had she concluded that a marriage was not indicated, that there was not enough mature love between the two to support the demands of parenthood, and had she come to me early enough, then I would have moved heaven and earth to find a respectable physician who took such work as their obedience to the promise of God that man is meant for a community of love in the family and in the world, and that this act would be an obedience to a higher law under the promise. Evans used to type his sermons before he read them, and underline to guide his expression. Demands of parenthood, act of obedience, promise of God. Every pastor had his favorite turns of phrase. In Greenwich Village, where Howard Moody ran his ministry in the manner of a keyed-up democratic community organizer, the Judson Memorial Church minister used language like man's vengeance on woman and a most odious violation of constitutional liberties and a matter of individual conscience and free choice. In the southern Missouri city of Springfield, where the Reverend Tom Raber was working as a Southwestern Missouri State University teacher and campus minister when the clergy service recruited him, Raber studied the Bible and considered his own ministry for some weeks before he said yes. Christian studies scholars sometimes make use of biblical concordances, volumes that serve as alphabetical indices to the Bible, and Raber examined his concordances for references that might be of help. He found womb in the concordances, and miscarriage, and conception, and life-giving, and life, but Raber could not find a single passage in which the word spoke directly about deliberately induced abortion. And the conclusion I came to, Raber recalls, is that the Bible is at least ambivalent, if not open to, abortion. Raber's parents had worked with the Salvation Army, and human despair had been part of the landscape around him for as long as he could remember. As a teenager, he had lived for a while in a North Dakota Salvation Army building in which 30 homeless men slept every night in the basement. It was not a romantic vista, either of poverty or of the unwanted child, a phrase that was making its way into every public abortion debate. And when Raber said yes to the clergy service work, he began to find that he was talking quite a bit about a compassionate God, a forgiving God, a God whose mercy would surely extend to the woman making that decision to abort rather than to bear a child she was not prepared to raise. That my first understanding of the nature of God is that God is a God of love, Raber recalls, and compassion. And from that, you begin to make the rest of your decisions about things. I looked at it and said, what would be the appropriate response for a Christian person dealing with another person who is just faced with a comparable dilemma? I guess the answer I got is, first of all, you have to help that person sort it out for themselves and let them know that they're valuable people regardless of what decision they make. Laws, the unhappy women in the chapel office, and all around them, the wild, exploding late 1960s mess of free love and birth control pills and posters that said, if it feels good, do it. The women were intensely frightened. He saw that very quickly. And it seemed to relieve them to know that a certified man of God did not think they were going to burn forever for whatever they were planning to do. In later years, Gottman would have his scriptural references lined up, and he could speak confidently about God creating human beings with minds and choices of their own. God has so constituted life, Gottman would say, that we are granted the awesome privilege and responsibility of choosing how we shall live. But when he started with the clergy service, he had no worked-out oratory to unroll the abortion laws. We're just old and wrong-headed and rendered obsolete. Gottman thought by the very women who sat before him and wished to know exactly what they needed to break them. They had the right to know it. It was wrong for them not to know it. Howard Moody had wondered in print what certain practices of the era might look like to an observer 2 centuries hence. Such a futuristic explorer could only surmise from the data he discovered that either these medieval 20th century people were ignorant and superstitious, Moody wrote in a particularly heated 1967 magazine article, or women in this society were the victims of an unforgivably cruel punishment stemming from some inexplicable hostility on the part of men. This was more flamboyant language than Gottman was inclined to use, but fundamentally not so different from what he believed. The problem was not free love or convulsing morals, although these certainly made life at the personal level look a great deal more complicated than it had a decade earlier. The problem, if Gottman had to identify the single meanest hurdle for the women that the Whitcomb sent down to the chapel to meet him, was the laws. The laws were walls, massive walls with little doors that were kept locked all the time, and moreover, were hidden from view, so that ordinary women couldn't find them unless men with important titles could be bothered to come around and point out their location. Then the men with important titles might, on very special occasions, pull out their keys and make a grand throat-clearing show of unlocking them or not unlocking them. Perhaps we will today, perhaps we won't. The ministers might have all been tunneling there in the clergy service chapel offices, clearing out their small conduits for women to crawl through. Keep your head down. Keep quiet. Call us when you get to the other side. And as the laws began to change in the months between 1967 and the beginning of 1970, Howard Moody shook his head impatiently and exhorted them to keep on tunneling. 80% of our cases, Moody declared in a 1969 New York Magazine interview, when the writer asked him what he thought of the efforts around the country to work the Model Penal Code's guidelines into law, wouldn't qualify under the proposed abortion codes. The shorthand for the Model Penal Code-inspired abortion law change was liberalization, a word that was supposed to suggest modern thinking and magnanimous flexibility. But it sounded faintly soiled when Howard Moody said it. Liberalization doesn't mean nothing, Moody drawled for the New York Magazine writer, whose anecdotal stories about the clergy service describe a clientele of women grateful for referrals, not to hospital review committees, but to men like the foreman, with efficient drivers in unmarked cars. Under liberalization, some abortions were permissible, and some were not. Under liberalization, a woman had to stick before doctors and plead her case. Liberalization was a fancier set of locked wall doors. A woman could see the doors now, but she didn't have to be wealthy or well-connected or near death to have them displayed to her. But she couldn't open them herself, and there were still those men with the keys, looking over her to decide for themselves what might have been meant. It had taken Howard Moody and his clergy service ministers only a few months to see this. Moody would say later, to understand that the fiercely debated two laws were proving to be of minimal use to the women who called their referral numbers for help. In Colorado, where the governor had signed the Model Penal Code with a small flourish of first state pride, uneasy hospital review committees worked so diligently to fend off abortion mill accusations that statewide the number of abortions approved for medical reasons rose to fewer than 300 the year after the law took effect. And that number included patients accepted from other states. In North Carolina, where the new law formally closed off the state to non-resident women who wanted abortions, most hospitals reported their 1968 abortion totals in numbers so low it might have been some unusual and remarkable disease they were tabulating. 5 in one hospital, 8 in another. In California, the numbers look more encouraging on paper. A 7-fold increase in therapeutic abortions the first year after liberalization, and 10-fold the year after that. But every abortion still demanded a 2-doctor approval for a fee, and a hospitalization for a bigger fee.
Fellow citizen, I'd like to make an inquiry.
I yield the microphone to you.
My name is Peter, and I'm a citizen of Missouri who strongly opposes the mandatory tripling of the mandatory waiting period for abortions. And I'm going to continue where we are in the story. The writer for the New York Times Magazine addressed the California situation at some length in December 1968. The title of his article generated considerable headlines among clergy service ministers. How California's abortion law is implemented. Here were accounts of women denied abortions by hospital committees, married women who reported having been raped, turned down, the article said, on the grounds that the pregnancy might be from her husband. A 17-year-old seduced by the man whose children she had been babysitting. She leaped from her family's garage roof after the abortion was denied, the article said, and died in the fall. California Clergy Service had its own collection of comparable stories. For every therapeutic abortion performed at the county hospital, 2 are turned away. The 2 California Clergy Service directors wrote in the summer 1968 memorandum from Los Angeles to their statewide ministers, most of whom were directing steady traffic to the illegal Mexican clinics a full year after the legalization law had gone into effect. About 6 or 7 are done per week. We sometimes see up to 10 pregnant women per day. The liberalization laws were failing, as Moody and most of his referral service ministers saw it, in the crudest and most practical terms. Women who wanted abortions were being told no, and they were failing in philosophical terms too. Even for some of the women who were being told yes, there was no procedure known to American medicine that required men to come before hospital committees and beg. No other variety of hospital patient was expected as a matter of routine to feign mental illness in order to receive the treatment she came for. When Moody and Spencer Parsons wrote and successfully lobbied into passage a resolution at the 1968 gathering of the American Baptist Convention, a denomination into which both ministers had been ordained, for the legalization never appeared in the text. Early abortion, the resolution declared, should instead be, at the request of an individuals concerned, be regarded as an elective medical procedure governed by the laws regulating medical practice and licensure. This was muted language, carefully arranged, with a radical notion at its core. The words, governed by the laws regulating medical procedure and licensure, had a particular meaning in abortion debates. What they meant, as Randall Williams had proposed more than a decade earlier, was not singled out in the legal code. This procedure is no more the state's business than the suturing of a woman. This was the message of the American Baptist Convention's resolution, which in 1968 made for so startling a proposition that even Howard Moody felt compelled to temper it for his fellow Baptist approval. As finally adopted, the resolution called for the abolishing of all laws restricting abortion during the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. Abortions after the 12th week, the resolution declared, should be permitted solely in hospitals and solely in pregnancies following rape or incest. Pregnancies likely to result in babies with serious birth defects, and pregnancies posing a physical or mental health danger, all the categories, in other words, of the model penal code. I think we had a feeling that was what we could get, Howard Moody recalls. It was a very early resolution on abortion, and it was unusually liberal for the time, for the church to be doing it. We were kind of shocked when it passed, but we had already pretty much decided by then, in the clergy consultation service, that repeal was the only way to go. Among the activists, and they were multiplying now, mailing our mimeographed newsletters from New York and Oregon, California, and Illinois, buoyed by reports of victory or promising legislative votes, a debate with a name like a prize fight began to spread around the states. Reform versus repeal. It was an argument suited to the contentious 1960s. Shall we smash the system or transform it gradually from within? And in letters, broadsheets, and long-distance telephone calls, partisans trod some of the same ground as rebellious university students as they made their impassioned pitches about philosophy and compromise and the political realities of introducing change. What California and Colorado and North Carolina had done to their abortion laws, if one believed enough to this approach to use vocabulary without irony, was reform. The model penal code language was reformed. Reform was every bill that encompassed within its provisions the basic principle of century-old American abortion law. The idea that the decision to perform an abortion must remain the business of the state. Acid-tongued activists in certain parts of the country have written about what seemed to them the mealiness of the model penal code language even before the earliest reform bills were signed into law. One of the very earliest, and indefatigable, California woman named Lena Clark Bellion wrote this letter to the Oklahoma abortionist W.J. Brian Henry, just as the California abortion bill was nearing the governor's desk in 1967. I'm sure you've heard prior to now that Tony Billeson's pathetic bill got through the Senate and has passed on to the California Assembly, and that Ronald I, boy idiot governor, has stated he will pass it if it comes to his desk for signature now, that it has been revised to refuse abortion to women bearing deformed fetuses. On the bright side of the ledger, the law must go, in its entire damaged savagery, and every thinking person knows it, So California will at least speak the dirty word abortion right out loud from the hallowed halls of Sacramento. Perhaps the smaller states will grab the much-needed ball and run with it by way of further amendments, which will lead to more sanity. I know Valencia has his medical requirements limited to consent of 2 doctors before 13 weeks, and 3 after that, until just 20 weeks after that. Absolutely nothing can be done. If we could just delete the hospital requirement, perhaps it might be workable, but only for a few privileged people. I cannot imagine any decent woman subjecting herself to this humiliation. I would go to Mexico in a flash. Lena Thalan, who held up the Southern California end at a noisy little West Coast organization called the Society for Humane Abortion, was an extremely respectable working woman, employed as a legal secretary, married to a parole officer, and grandmother to 3 children. When newspapers ran her photograph, she was usually smiling, with a choker of pearls around her neck, and the kind of precise curled hairdo that suggested regular visits to the beauty parlor. She was a prolific correspondent, sitting up late at night at the electric typewriter in den of her small house in Long Beach. As far back as 1965, amid the nation's earliest overtures to abortion law change, Milan had formed a merry alliance with the London Northern California medical technician, who often managed to look outrageous in print. Politicians insist that they have to have their nose up our skirts, the outrageous Patricia Magnus once remarked at a speaking engagement in Rapid City, South Dakota, prompting the local newsman to lead his write-up the following morning with what must have been a real conversation starter of a quote. McGinnis was an Oklahoma-born Women's Army Corps veteran, unmarried and attractive in a delicate, distracted sort of way. When they traveled together, Milan would remind her to comb her hair and make herself look a little prissier, as Milan put it, before the photographers arrived. In California, the Milan McGinnis letters flew from one end of the state to the other, creating breaking news and dispatches from the Mexican clinics and venomous tidbits about this or that misguided male politician. To Rona Gerner, the woman who shared with McGinnis the running of the Society for Humane Abortions, cramped little office in San Francisco, Milan wrote around 1966, the lecture at Long Beach State Police Administration, Vice Division, went beautifully. And for 3 hours, I had 50 cops for breakfast. We would have loved hearing me tell those cops how brave and professional they must feel questioning a bleeding and terrorized woman, threatening her with death if she didn't talk before her family and lawyer got there. One man denied it vehemently, said he'd never heard such nonsense, and another stood up and said, "Shut up, you've done it 100 times, and the ladies tell the truth. You feel like a louse, and it's a hell of a job, and we're better off without the laws on the books." McGinnis and Gerner, a rebellious New Yorker who had relocated to the West Coast by bicycle in 1963, Gerner spent 4 months riding a 3-speed alone across the country, arriving in California with a sleeping bag and a fly swatter and a pack full of clothing, and joined forces as the Society for Humane Abortion in 1964, renaming an older and weaker California group called the Citizens Committee for Humane Abortion Laws. It was not incidental that the word laws disappeared from the new group's letterhead. In 1965, even as early versions of the model penal code bill were being shoved into desk drawers by legislators who could not imagine this controversial language surviving a vote, Pat McGinnis was posting herself on San Francisco street corners to hand out pamphlets that demanded the repeal of all abortion laws. It was not possible to fix laws that gave men the right to tell women what to do with their bodies, the society declared. Such laws must be abolished. If they could not be abolished, they ought to be defied. "Are you pregnant?" one of the early leaflets began, in the McGinnis-Gerner sledgehammer style. They printed a detailed, annotated list of illegal Mexican abortionists, indicating who spoke English and who used anesthetic, and who might be on vacation to avoid the police. They offered precise instructions on negotiating price, managing hostile taxi drivers, and watching the abortionist for cleanliness. Tell the specialist that you want to see him scrub his own hands and arms with piso X. If the specialist carelessly rests his gloved hand on anything or any part of the operating table, his hand is no longer sterile. Tell him to be scrubbed. And they advertised free classes. An accelerated course in abortion, one of the flyers read, in which women gathered in a private home or rented hall to learn details not commonly available during the mid-1960s. Curriculum. 1. Anatomy of female reproductive organs. 2. Sterile technique. 3. After abortion care and methods of contraception. 4. Methods of abortion. A. Dilation and curettage. B. Vacuum aspirator. C. Intra-amniotic saline injection. D. Self-induced abortions, only for women who have given birth previously by normal delivery, not cesarean section. A. Digital method. B. Saline lavage. 5. Dangers involved. 6. How to deal with police questioning. 7. How to locate abortion specialists in foreign countries. Lena Fallon and Pat McGinnis began running these classes together in 1966, usually with social workers and newspaper writers and undercover police officers scattered throughout the audience. The third time I was in the San Diego area to do the class, McGinnis recalled in 1975 oral history, this poor plainclothesman. I felt so sorry for him. He had heard the lecture 4 times. They started in California and moved rapidly north and east to Oregon, New Mexico, and Wisconsin, and Ohio, in a packed-to-capacity apartment in Washington, D.C. Between them, they worked a defiant roadshow that every locale promised to be quite unlike anything that had ever come through the town before. Lena Fallon had a small background speech she'd like to offer as a warm-up. The first contraception and abortion laws were European canon laws. Fallon would explain the laws of the Catholic Church, which wanted women to produce as many little worshippers as possible. She would tell her audience that Western governments had embraced these archaic laws, which dated from a time when women had neither vote nor voice in the running of the land, and used them to try to compel motherhood whether women wanted it or not. She would tell them that people are invented in spite of church. She would tell them that the people are invented in spite of church and government authority, that a woman would drag herself like a wounded animal to illegal abortions, rather than bear a child she could not raise. Then she would look at her audience and say, I have to tell you how I know this. It happened to me. When Lena Fallon had her abortion, she was 17 years old, married to a much older man, and already the mother of 1 baby. We would always begin the story that way. It was 1938, High Depression times. Lena Kitchen, that was her name then, lived in the central Florida town of Lakeland, where she worked behind the counter for Walgreens. She had married at 15 and given birth at 16, in a labor that went on for 3 days and left her so sick that the nurses tiptoed in and out of her hospital room. Her doctor told her she would never survive another labor, but did not, Fallon would always point out, tell her how to keep from getting pregnant. Within a year, she was pregnant again. The doctor confirmed it for her in his office. Fallon recalls, after she missed a menstrual period, he said, I told you not to get pregnant. I said, but you didn't tell me how not to. He said, well, I'll see if I can keep you alive. That was what I had to go on. I'll see if I can keep you alive. And all I knew was, I was not quite 17 years old. I had a baby that was in such bad shape, and my husband, dear and sweet as he was a man that things happened to. He never made things happen. And I thought, I'm going to die. I was worried sick about it. I talked to a couple of girls I knew. The girl over in cosmetics said, well, I've heard of a woman in Ford City outside of Tampa. I heard that she would do this. And I went back to see her. Great, big, stout, black woman. Whether she was Cuban or black, I don't know. But she was kind. She didn't question me. She just said, well, honey, I'll do it. It'll cost you $50. $50. I went back to work. $50? It was a lot of money then. I couldn't tell anybody what I was doing. I was still sick. I was all to pieces, and I thought, what am I going to do? So I started saving. It took me nearly 4 months to get that $50. I finally got 40, and I sold everything I had that I could get away with. I lied and said I had gotten paid less than I had. I didn't tell my husband. At that time, he was going to school. He didn't know I was pregnant. This is not a thing you can tell. Nobody suspected. So I had $40. I needed $10 more. In desperation, I borrowed it from a customer, a man that ran a local automobile agency. To this day, I think the man knew what I wanted that money for. It was secret money. So secret, you can't imagine. I'm sure I had it in a little bag or a little purse, because I didn't want anyone to stop me. I knew what I had to do. I knew I had to stay alive, because I had to raise that child. So I took the streetcar as fast as I could, and I walked. It was about 8 or 10 miles from my house to where she was. She had this little gurney in the back. It was clean, rough but clean. It had white linen sheeting or something, and a little pillow. It was covered with white. It had panties on it.
I got surgical pans, an animal. They had instruments and things. They were covered. I'm sure there was not a sterilizing device or anything there. I was so frightened. All I knew was I had to have this thing done. I didn't even know what it was. She was very kind to me. She put the stuff in a slippery elm, I think. And she said, now, go home. In 4 or 5 days, your period will come, and then you will expel this. Everything will fall out of you. That's the way she put it. Everything will fall out. So I went home. 2 or 3 days later, I was running a fever, and I knew. But I went to work. I worked with this fever. I couldn't tell anybody. It was 2 or 3 days I worked with that fever. This was an absolute horror. I'll tell you because maybe someday other women won't go through it quite so bad. I went to my sister-in-law's for dinner with my husband. My sister-in-law was the matriarch of the family. Considerably older than both of us, dinner was a commanding performance. And I was at the table when I felt these awful pains. I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I looked down at myself. I sat down on the john and looked at myself. My God, I nearly collapsed. I was bleeding. There was blood all over me. And the worst thing, there was a little tiny lamb of some kind. I don't know whether it was foot or an arm, protruding from my vagina. All I could see was that. It was so tiny. It was like, oh God, a pipe stem thing. But all I knew was, what do I do now? How do I fix this? I hadn't told anybody anything. So quickly I took the toilet tissue and made gobs of toilet tissue, and I poked everything back up inside of me. Just pushed until everything went back inside. And I wiped up all the blood. Cleaned myself up because it wasn't on my dress. I went back to the table and I said, I have such a headache. I can't even hold my head up. I've got to go home. My husband said, I'll take you home. And I said, no, stay and have dinner. I got out of there and took a cab as far as I had money for, and I walked the rest of the way. It must have been a mile or so, but I didn't have any more money. When I got there, the house was dark, and I thought, oh my God. She had said not to come back, but I didn't have any choice. I went around the house. It was so black and dark. I knocked on her side door. I guess she had gone to bed, because she came to the door and she said, I told you not to come back here. And I said, I had to. I was crying, and she let me in. She put me up on the gurney, and she said, oh my, you're almost finished. I have to clean you up. I felt really comforted when I got back to her, because it was someone to share my secret with. She cleaned me up, and I was laying on the gurney, just sobbing my heart out. And I'll never forget that woman. She was so wonderful. She came around, big black lady. She put her arms around me on the gurney. She put her face down near mine. She kind of put her cheek up next to mine. And she said, honey, did you think it was so easy to be a woman? That was the story Lena Falon told. She did not cry when she told it, because it had happened a long time ago, and she had made a kind of decision about that when she saw that she was going to be talking about it before a public audience. But in the audience, women would cry, usually without making any noise. An awful stillness would come over the room when Falon began her abortion story. And when she looked at the faces of the women who were listening, she could see them sitting there with their cheeks wet, and their hands up to their mouths. And in that moment, she believed sometimes that she could tell by watching which among them had done the same thing. She would introduce pathogenists to talk about medicine, mechanics, practical matters that must not be forgotten. Have people write down the phrase, no hablo español, for use over the phone if necessary, read one of the hygienist class outlines. Taxi drivers sometimes know the only doctors operating, or the quacks. Sophisticated women may know how to differentiate, e.g., girl and father were beaten up in a hotel, story of 2 women on separate occasions who paid over $600 and $400 respectively. The doctor pulled out a catheter from her pocket and shoved it in the vagina. No infection, luckily, no abortion either. When the class was moving towards its close, both Virginis and Falon had delivered many warnings about what they were about to say. Virginis would talk about her abortions too, the illegal one in Mexico, from a Tijuana doctor who never said a word to her, and the 2 that she told people she managed to bring on herself. Virginis was capable of telling her abortion stories with a manic black humor. She had been raised in a strict Catholic family in Oklahoma and left to join the Army, abandoning her religious upbringing with such fervent distaste that when she talked about either church or family, she tended to use phrases like crippling Roman Catholic dogma and I wouldn't give a person a dime for marriage. She led what by her own account was monogamous but spirited heterosexual love life, and on 3 separate occasions during the late 1950s, as McGinnis put it in an oral history some years later, my great Catholic uterus, with all of its Catholic eggs, managed to put out another pregnancy. The first she disposed of, angrily but without lingering physical complications, in Mexico. The second 2, she decided to handle herself. That was how she would tell the story, by running catheters into her own uterus and driving to hospitals once the miscarriages had begun. All of those hospital people were just horrified that when I went in, I said, I have an induced abortion process. Because you didn't say this. No one ever said this. You had to lie and say you were spontaneously aborted, the judge recalled. So they left me alone in the examining room. I stopped the whole body and started to come off. The pain. It was just dreadful. Finally, I did manage to produce about a 6-month fetus, which got up off the table and cursed my Catholic uterus. Pat McGinnis used language like this with interviewers, not abortion class audiences. But even on the public stage, she was direct and unrepentant when she described the catheters and the Lysol solution, and the finger pushed deep and repeatedly into the vagina to irritate the mouth of the uterus and the miscarriage. These were dangerous techniques, McGinnis warned, requiring great patience and scrupulous cleanliness. The only thing immoral about them were the state laws that made them, for some women, the method of last resort. It is probably safe to assume that no one in the United States had ever spoken quite this way before a public audience. Rowena Gerner, the office administrator and third lady for Society of Human Abortion, of the Society for Humane Abortion Tripod, would describe with minimal prompting the details of her illegal abortion. She had flown to Puerto Rico back when she lived in Manhattan, and when she talked about the experience, the only audible emotion was angry impatience, as though she had been exiled to foreign territory for what ought to have been a medical procedure as straightforward as appendectomy. Gerner was exasperated by hand-wringers who wanted to carry on about the tragic decision. In 1967, a caller suggested that society check into a certain plant's properties, and Gerner cheerfully told a newspaperman that she planned to become pregnant so she could try swallowing some. If it doesn't work, I'll get an abortion anyway, Gerner said. In any case, it won't come to terms.
Missouri, I'd like to make an inquiry.
I'll yield the microphone.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Erin, and I'm here filibustering because I'm sick of politicians interfering in my personal medical decisions. I'm going to just start here where Peter left off. The plan never materialized, but the public point was made. These were women who would shout the words from any available microphone because they had been to abortionists. They knew what it felt like. They were not the first women in America to run Lysol into their bodies or come weeping to midwives in the middle of the night. But they were the first women sufficiently inflamed by resentment and unencumbered by timidity or moral ambiguity to hold forth about it in lecture halls. And as the names of new abortion organizations began materializing one by one in different parts of the country, Pat Menegas and her comrades formed the Rowdy Western Radical Wing for a movement working hard to present its controversial proposals in somewhat less flamboyant style. The Wisconsin Committee to Legalize Abortion, the California Committee for Therapeutic Abortion, the Organization for Abortion Law Reform, the Association for the Study of Abortion. It was not coincidental that almost none of the new organizations contained in their capitalized titles the word repeal. Repeal sounds radical, recalls Lonnie Myers, the Chicago anesthesiologist who joined the minister Spencer Parsons in 1966 to help set up a name of Illinois citizens for medical control of abortion. Myers and Parsons both believed in repeal. The Colorado liberalization sounded to both of them like a bunch of men deciding for a woman whether or not this should happen to her. Myers said in an oral history, as though it were any of their goddamn business. But they thought it strategically inept to leave a certain ambiguity in their organization's name. It didn't work, at least not in the early years. Pushing any change in the wording of abortion laws was controversy enough, and when polls were taken, they tended to show physicians, like the general public, leaning steadily toward the model penal code principle, legal abortion only for those cases that physicians in society have collectively ruled appropriate. When the Harvard Divinity School and the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation co-sponsored a Washington, D.C. abortion symposium in 1967 Physicians, ethicists, lawyers, and theologians spent 3 days wrestling over English questions about whether the law ought properly to be tampered with at all. What proof should be required of rape to justify abortion? A published summary of the conference proceedings read, highlighting some of the starting point questions for lengthy discussion among the participants. What proof of defectiveness in the fetus will be required? Should a pregnant unwed girl be allowed an abortion? For the duration of that symposium, Lena Felon and Pat Menegas paraded outside the conference hotel with the large cardboard signs that Younger Society for Humane Abortion volunteers had laid out for them. On one side, above the words, "No contraceptive is 100% safe," was a small array of birth control devices, including real diaphragms and condoms. During one windy moment, the condom on Felon's sign tore partly loose and unrolled into a startling little banner that set off enthusiastic hooting and waving from the passing traffic. The other side displayed a knitting needle and a wire coat hanger, and the words "End Butchery" along the top with Felon's sign in large black letters so they would show up when the newsmen came to take their picture on the sidewalk. Neither Felon nor any of the other vocal repeal advocates had been invited to participate inside, and the views of groups like the Society for Humane Abortion were examined during the proceedings only as the advocates snapped back. This conference, despite the trappings of objectivity, seems to those of us who have been trying to build a movement to be primarily aimed at smothering recent progress. Lawrence later recalled in his 1973 memoir, Abortion 2, Making the Revolution. The speakers and panelists were largely Catholics or anti-abortion in their views, and the repeal position was virtually ignored. There was some exaggeration to this swipe. The panelist list included Protestants, Jews, and at least one law professor who was in fact a Jesuit, willing to make a convoluted case for full repeal. But it did not include Larry Lader, who in the wake of his 1966 book, Abortion, was becoming an insistent and widely publicized advocate for the proposition that abortion was a national scandal precisely because of the laws that prohibited it. In the name of observing the law, shameful injustice is committed, Lader had written in the New York Times Magazine in 1965, as he was contemplating what was to become the first of his 3 books on abortion. Women suffer needless grief and pain. The medical profession is intimidated and confused. The law is a heritage of ecclesiastical history based on religious dogma rejected by most of our population. In the modest roster of men and women willing to attack American abortion law in public, Larry Lader was something of an oddity. He was not a minister with memories of parishioners' private troubles. He was not a doctor with war stories from the hospital wards. His own conversion, the way he told the story, included no desperate friends or family members knocking on abortionist doors. Later was a writer. He would explain he made his living writing magazine articles and books. For some years, he had volunteered in New York liberal Democratic organizations before 1950. He had taken on an unpaid district organizing job for a local Democratic congressman whose leftist politics attracted accusations of communist sympathizing. And when Lader set about looking for a subject suitable for full-length biography, what finally attracted him was what seemed to him the life of uncompromising political and social defiance. His book, The Margaret Sanger Story, was published in 1955 after 2 years of research and interviews. It was a lively book because Lader was an entertaining writer, but the Margaret Sanger it described was so saintly a crusader in her 50-year campaign for birth control in the United States and abroad that some critics and subsequent biographers dismissed Lader's research as a rehash of Sanger's own sanitized version of her complex and controversial life. Lader remembers that he did let his surprising admiration for Sanger rather vividly color the text. It isn't what you'd call an objective book, he recalls, but in any case, objectivity had always interested him less than militancy. His second book, in keeping with this deepening interest, was about militant New England abolitionists. His third book, because at first no one would touch it as a magazine article, he recalls, even after he sent written proposals to dozens of editors around the country, was Abortion. It was birth control that led him to abortion. Later told interviewers afterward, the 2 subjects followed each other by logic, historically and socially, because even when contraceptive methods are legal and readily obtainable, they do not always work. Margaret Sanger herself had assailed abortion as barbaric, but later assumed that Sanger based her opposition not on the procedure itself, but rather on the danger to which turn-of-the-century New York Lower East Side women exposed themselves by frequenting illegal abortionists. So later, the underlying principle was what mattered.
Margaret Sanger had devoted her public life to vehement prose and oratory about a woman's right to control her own body. If women have the right to prevent contraception, then they must also have the right to prevent birth. The logic of this proposition appeared unassailable till later, and when his publisher held a press conference to announce the release of the book, later explained that since the publication the previous year of the New York Times Magazine article, hundreds of women had written or telephoned him to ask how they might find one of the abortion doctors he had written about. And I decided in a flash of a second, all right, I've shut my mouth off. I will become an activist, he recalls. I said, I will help women. If they write or phone me, I will get them to medical help. By 1966, in Larry Lader's Upper West Side apartment, the letters began to accumulate, just as they were accumulating in the Little Society for Humane Abortion office in San Francisco, with their postmarks from many states away. Please call me collect in Houston. Time is of the essence. I am pregnant and my husband has disappeared. It is very urgent that I talk with you. A few physicians made contact with Lader themselves, saying, well, I know of an organized ring that will do a clean job, or look, I can only do 8 or 9 a week. This is what Lader had written about in his abortion book. A world and a practice that ran on its own without any perceivable regard for the wording of the law, except that the law made it ridiculous, as Lader came to see it. Demeaning, dangerous, profoundly hypocritical. He began giving lectures, offering himself for the radio and in speaking engagements that he would refer women to abortionists. He urged on the launching of the Clergy Consultation Service. He joined the Association for the Study of Abortion, which in 1966 was New York's general counterpart to the Society for Humane Abortion. The ASA was a resolutely scholarly organization, its leatherhead heavy with MDs and PhDs. Nobody from the ASA talked about self-induced abortions or politicians sticking their noses up women's skirts. After its charter meeting in 1967, as the Model Penal Code abortion language was receiving an early airing in New York, the ASA put out a newsletter that was meant to look both academic and appropriately prudent for a non-profit group trying to maintain its tax status. Many of the members were veterans of the birth control organization of the 1950s and 60s. Planned Parenthood and the Human Betterment Association for Voluntary Sterilization. For some years now, Margaret Sanger's women's emancipation speeches notwithstanding, their arguments had focused far less on women's rights than on what was described as the evolving public and social good. The world's population was exploding and must be contained. Families in poverty must be given the means to keep their numbers manageable. The Human Race, as one Human Betterment Association press release phrased it in 1964, must look both to birth control and to voluntary sterilization to protect itself against the invading horde of the yet unborn. At the Association for the Study of Abortion, the Model Penal Code was described as a laudable goal, at once prudent and enlightened. A society modern enough to maintain its population by birth control, the argument suggested, ought to be able to reason its way to legal abortion next, as humane medical practice geared toward the social welfare. And just as birth control was advancing gradually into American society, pushing step by step past barriers of social disapproval, religious condemnation and the law on now legal abortion might be poised to make the same delicate passage. The ACA bulletins were careful and upbeat, reporting promising developments from around the states, and by 1968, both Lader and the Illinois abortion activist Lonnie Myers were part of an inpatient ASA contingent, the militants, as Lader would refer to them. Lader, who had lost interest in the slow pace and philosophical timidity of reform. When Myers and Lader helped organize a 1969 conference in Chicago to launch an entirely new abortion group, they put the challenge in block letters on the cover of the conference flyers. First National Conference on Abortion Laws, Modification or Repeal. The argument was stacked from the outset. I've already told Lonnie I agree the groups favoring moderate reform should be invited and represented, Lader wrote in a memo to Myers and other conference organizers, but that we must prove decisively what this approach is pointless and bound to fail. In the circles Lader was traveling in, this was not hard to prove. It took the conference planners so long to find a speaker to defend the case for modification that they had to print to be announced on the programs. How to Start a Repeal Group was a conference workshop with panelists from New York and California and Nevada and Colorado. There was no workshop on how to start a reform group, and on the conference's final day, a long and tumultuous meeting produced an organizational acronym that left no uncertainty when it spelled out. NARAL, the National Association for Repeal of Abortion Laws. One life, that was the essence of repeal. If there were two lives, it would be society's business. Society has something to say about what we may and may not do to another person. But it was not two lives, it was one. A woman who wanted an abortion was one person standing there with her own insides, the tissue of her uterus, an internal organ, a matter for medical people to manage without being forced one way or the other by the dictates of the law. In New York, an assemblywoman named Constance Cook, an upstate Republican of mild good humor and famously a calm demeanor, listened over and over to her colleagues in the legislature as they shouted and argued and rewrote and compromised and still could not manage the votes for a model penal code bill that had been reintroduced repeatedly since 1965. What Al kept doing was compromising, trying to negotiate, Cook recalled in an oral history many years later, remembering the efforts of Manhattan Assemblyman Robert Buchenwald to make his model penal code bill palatable enough to get through the legislature. There was no model repeal bill to work from, so Cook and a few other state legislators around the country began writing the text of their blunt new proposals, but in principle there was not very much to say. An abortional fact is justifiable when performed by a licensed physician. That was the essential language of what comes to be called the Cook-Leitner Bill, hyphenated to include the name of Manhattan Democratic Assemblyman Frank Leitner. In its original form, the bill was more a proposal to remove subheadings of the statute book than to replace them with anything else. I checked the health law, Cook recalled, and I reached the conclusion that this was a medical procedure and the health law required its being done by a doctor. So we didn't need a statute that said so. Constance Cook was 50 years old when her abortion bill, widely described as one of the most far-reaching proposals in the United States, began finding its way to the front pages of the newspapers in New York. She and Leitner introduced it in 1969, watched it wither in committee, and reintroduced it for the 1970 session. When her name and photograph began appearing alongside the abortion headlines, she had school martish glasses, an all-business face, and a resume that suggested nothing but the diligent career of a widely respected legislator. Law degree, Fulbright scholar, legal work for the governor and legislative committees. When she ran for office, she toured Ithaca in the countryside in a 1924 Packard, her husband at the wheel, that was generally reported as her only feint its showiness. And in the legislature, she specialized in educational law and budget formulas for school districts. Not traditionally an attention-grabbing corner of the Albany area, a tailored matronly manner, a New York Times reporter wrote in 1970, rarely raising her voice and never doubting ultimate success. Cook had no stories to tell about unwanted pregnancy in her own life. She had suffered a miscarriage at 35 when she very much wanted to start a family, and then went on to give birth to a daughter and a son. But she was a woman at work beside long rows of men, one of 4 women in that 150-member assembly, the only woman Republican. She had been invited one afternoon in 1967 to join a gathering of women at an apartment in the Dakota, a splendid old Manhattan apartment with soaring ceilings and views out into Central Park. The women had decided that they had to move politically, they had to get some legislation, and they wanted to know how to do it, Cook recalled. Betty was Betty Friedan, the president of a memorable acronymed organization then marking its first year of existence, the National Organization for Women. By 1967, Friedan's book had actually been out for 4 years, but so formidable was its weight in 1966, when Now was created by women from 2 tables at Washington, D.C., Conference of State Commissions on the Status of Women. The feminist mystique had sold millions of copies and was widely regarded as a founding document. The chapter titles had entered the American vernacular for a certain breed of women left profoundly dissatisfied by the expectations of post-war society. The problem that has no name, the crisis in women's identity, the happy housewife heroine, the progressive dehumanization, the comfortable concentration camp. The feminine mystique, which began as a 15 years after graduation survey of Friedan Smith's college classmates, was a grand-scale lament about educated women of the 1950s middle class, in particular suburban housewives, a phrase Friedan, a regularly published magazine writer, often used to describe herself. Gradually, without seeing it clearly for quite a while, I came to realize that something is very wrong with the way American women are trying to live their lives today. Read the opening lines in the preface to Friedan's book, and for the next 400 pages, Friedan went on to describe a world of women made desperate and deeply depressed by an insistent modern mythology that women by nature are genuinely fulfilled only as wives and mothers. The word abortion never appeared in the feminist mystique. Freedom exhorted women to continue their educations and find their way back into the world outside their households. And the National Organization for Women was launched when opening statements that spoke in sweeping terms about full participation in the mainstream of American society and truly equal partnership with men. The political meeting to which Constance Cook had been invited that afternoon in 1967 took place in Betty Friedan's apartment, and the women gathered in the apartment had much on their minds besides the eventual fate of the Model Penal Code bill. They asked about labor law changes, jury duty, and then somebody at the meeting said something about abortion, Cook recalled. Everyone agreed it was a terrible situation and ought to be changed, and they said, "How would you do it?" I said, "Well, the first thing you have to do, you have to have a bill." From the outset, there was discord about placing legalized abortion on the now agenda, for that was precisely what was taking shape and gathering permanently the role of women in American society. When 300 women and men met in Washington in November 1967 for the contentious Now Conference, that was to produce an 8-item We Demand manifesto. Items 1 through 7 ran through child care, job training, poverty programs, educational opportunity, the tax code, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, and the United States Constitution. Abortion was the very last word in item 8. The right of women to control their reproductive lives, and at the conference, some women spoke ardently against including it. Too controversial, they argued, and too likely to alienate potential support. But the yes votes carried, and when right was printed into the Now Bill of Rights, it displayed no uncertainty about reform versus repeal. The right of women to control their own reproductive lives by removing from the penal code laws, limiting access to contraceptive information and devices, and by repealing laws governing abortion. But the full text is now. Announcing with a vengeance the arrival of an innocuous new presence of the abortion debate. "Don't talk to me about abortion reform," declared Betty Friedan from a public stage in the 1969 meeting that produced the National Association for Repeal of Abortion Laws. Abortion reform is something dreamed up by men, maybe good-hearted men, but they can only think from their male points of view. For them, women are passive objects that somehow must be regulated. Let them only have abortions for rape and incest. What right have they to say? What right has any man to say to any woman, "You must bear this child"? What right has any state to say? This is a woman's right, not a technical question needing the sanction of the state, nor to be debated in terms of technicalities. They are all irrelevant. In her speech, Frieden described Now's Bill of Rights and the decision to list abortion among them. At that time, New York State was having a constitutional convention, and Larry later invited me to a meeting of all the different groups, church groups, medical groups, Planned Parenthood, and the rest, who were working on abortion reform. I said, "We're going into the New York State Constitutional Convention, demanding a Bill of Rights for women, and we are going to demand that it be written into the Constitution that the right of a woman to control her reproductive process must be established as a civil right, a right not to be denied or abridged by the state." Most of the people at that table, people working on abortion reform, were men. They looked at me in absolute horror as if I was out of my mind. They said, "You don't know what you are talking about. You're not an expert on this. You women have never done anything like this. You're just going to rock the boat. This isn't the way to go about it. You listen to us." And it was not an entirely new concept that Freedom was introducing. The description of abortion as a woman's civil right. But no respectable abortion group had suggested out loud this tip of the iceberg view of the work before them. That legal abortion be sought not as a public health measure or a compassionate moral compromise, but instead as part of a massive change in traditional assumptions about women in American society. Without the full capacity to limit her own reproduction, a woman's other freedoms are tantalizing mockeries that cannot be exercised, wrote Lucinda Sisler, an architectural student who became intensely involved in the New York abortion repeal effort in the 1970 collection, Sisterhood is Powerful, an anthology of the women's liberation movement. With it, the others cannot be denied since the chief rationale for denial disappears. Demand that your legislators repeal all laws limiting access to contraception, sterilization, or abortion, and that they actively oppose any measures that restrict the access in any way. The National Organization for Women was the earliest and most widely publicized of the scores of organizations that came to be grouped as the modern women's movement. Social historians sometimes use the term second wave feminism to distinguish this from the suffragists of the 19th century who began their campaign for the vote for women. Legal abortion was deliberately left off the list of some of these organizations' public goals. The Women's Equity Action League, for example, was founded in 1968 by Midwestern women who believed now was inviting trouble and offending otherwise interested women by including abortion in its We Demand manifesto. But much of the new movement was adamant about the linkage between legal abortion and women's equality. And during the closing years of the 1960s, as Constance Cook was commencing her effort to repeal the New York abortion laws, second-wave feminists, particularly defiant left-wing women, applying certain organizing and political techniques from the civil rights and student anti-war movements, became some of the most insistent, inventive abortion repeal advocates in New York. At Judson Memorial, Howard Moody's Church in Greenwich Village, women gathered in the big basement room to take turns speaking publicly about their illegal abortions. Entire sessions of conscience raising, the women-only private discussions that formed such an integral part of the movement's early years were given over to stories about illegal abortion. A New York legislative committee discussing abortion law reform was broken up. Its members finally flamed a closed-door session when a dozen women stood in the audience to shout that almost all the speakers were men.
Fellow Missourians, may I make an inquiry?
Yes, I yield the microphone.
Thank you. Hello again. I'm Ilea Stites, the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Planned Parenthood of Kansas and Mid-Missouri, and I believe that all people should have the right to reproductive health choices. I'll continue where my colleague left off. And by the spring of 1970, as Cook and Franz Lichter began preparing for a second try at a bill to repeal the New York abortion law, a small but vocal and strongly feminist group called New Yorkers for Abortion Law Repeal was publicly denouncing the Cook-Lichter bill on the grounds that the bill did not go far enough. Legislative subcommittee changes had modified the bill in certain philosophically important ways. No longer an unadorned repeal of the state abortion statute, the Cook-Lichter bill now contained language requiring physicians, not nurses or paramedics, whose work might come more cheaply, to do the abortions. It set a time limit on elective abortions, 24 weeks into pregnancy, unless the mother's life were at stake. At a certain stage, your body suddenly belongs to the state, wrote an acerbic Lucinda Sisler, one of the leaders of the group denouncing the bill, in an attack that was published both in the women's journal Notes from the Second Year, Radical Feminism, and in the more widely read Ramparts. If one believed in feminist principles, Sisler argued, then one must understand a woman's body always to be her own. Compromise, by its very nature, is the essential point. She belongs to herself and not to the state. A chain of aluminum does feel lighter around our necks than one made of iron, but it's still a chain, and our task is to burst entirely free. There was some alarm about compromise at the fledgling National Association for Repeal of Abortion Laws, too, particularly with regard to the 24-week limit. The word repeal was supposed to mean precisely that. This was what the assembled activists has debated so heatedly at the founding conference in Chicago. It plunged the executive committee into a two-day crisis, wrote Larry Lader, who by 1970 was completing his first year as NARAL's executive director, recalling the New York legislative campaigns in Abortion 2, Making the Revolution. But Constance Cook and her state Senate allies were resolute when NARAL board members telephoned to press for full and unqualified repeal. The abortion bill was already a tough sell, Cook declared, what with the Catholic archdiocese denouncing it and legislators making speeches about the murder of children. And without the 24-week limit and the physicians-only provision, it was lost. I said, look, it's this or nothing, Constance Cook recalls. I said, we haven't sacrificed our basic principle, which is that it's a matter of right. We've only cut the time, and most people realize that isn't terribly significant. Nobody really wants to have abortion in the second trimester. Cook herself did not much like the compromises either, but in later years she acknowledged that she would have given away far more if she had felt it were necessary. What she really wanted was legal, no questions asked abortions during the first few months of pregnancy, which Cook believed was when most women went to abortionists anyway, or could go to abortionists. If
procedure were legal and available without the indignity of the Hospital Therapeutic Abortion Committee. And when the neighborhood board did vote to support her bill, splitting what had been the New York chapter into two warring camps, it seemed to Cook that it was not so bad to have the word compromise flung like an epithet in her direction. She had always believed that what would finally bring her bill to passage was the guilty conscience of a room full of male legislators. Cook knew those men. She knew they had daughters and sisters and girlfriends. She had listened to a few of them finish their eloquent anti-abortion speeches and then approach her privately to tell her that of course she was right. I hope you win. Cook recalls one of her state senate colleagues telling her, I hope and pray you win, but I'm going to vote against you. She also knew that politicians will vote with more enthusiasm for something that looks like compromise. And by the early weeks of April 1970, when the Cook-Leiter bill arrived before the New York Assembly with the potential to change 20th century abortion practice far beyond the boundaries of New York State, Cook was not especially sorry to be branded a compromiser as the legislators prepared to cast their vote. On paper, what the members had before them was not altogether unprecedented. A fifth of the nation's legislatures, from Colorado on, had already approved the principle of qualified legal abortion by adopting some version of the model penal code. And earlier that spring, after intensely emotional state house and community debates, legislators in two other states, first Hawaii, then more recently Alaska, had approved laws that came far closer to actual repeal. Legal abortion for any reason, as long as the fetus was non-viable and the abortion was performed by a physician. But Hawaii and Alaska were lightly populated states, a daunting distance from the mainland, and both states' new legislation contained language limiting abortion to residents only. A matter of very different magnitude confronted the New York legislature. The Cook-Leiter bill contained no residency requirement, and if the bill were to pass it contained no residency requirement. And if the bill were to pass into law, a vast network of buses, trains, freeways, and airlines would suddenly link the entire nation to a state where abortion was legal and available to any woman with the means to pay for the procedure and her transport to New York. No screening committee would pass judgment on abortion patients. No psychiatrist would inquire into their mental health. No penalty of perjury statement would be placed before them to ensure that they lived within the boundaries of the state in which they were about to abort. In practical terms, the Cook-Leiter bill proposed to legalize abortion not only for New York women, but also for women in Chicago, and Philadelphia, and Boston, and Detroit, and St. Louis, which by airplane was 2.5 hours away, and had in place an efficient referral system, clergy consultation service, to help Missouri women travel safely to New York for their abortions. The crucial vote came on April 9th. The New York State Senate had voted preliminary approval of the abortion bill already, after 5 hours of standing room only debate. The State Assembly had defeated the abortion bill once, narrowly, after 8 hours of debate. Governor Nelson Rockefeller had all but guaranteed his signature should a bill survive both Senate and the Assembly vote. I continue to believe very strongly that the state's archaic abortion law must be changed, he declared in his January address to the legislature. And now some parliamentary maneuvering had brought the bill back to the Assembly for reconsideration, for one last vote that would kill it, or send it back for certain Senate reapproval and then the governor's signature. Once more the speeches flowed, the arguments banged around the great assembly chamber, the galleries filled with women leaning down to make out the sound of the assemblymen declaiming into the microphones at their desks. At one point, during the height of the debate, an elderly woman in the galleries had to be stilled by the Capitol Police, wrote the New York Times reporter at the Albany State House. "Murderer," she called out, and her thin voice quivering in the still chamber. "You are murderers, that's what you are. God will punish you, you are murderers." 75 votes, that's what they needed in the Cook-Leiter camp to bring legal abortion to the state of New York. Technically, the required number of votes was 76. But because the New York Assembly Speaker, Perry Dervia, had promised, in the event of a tie, to cast a vote in favor of the bill, despite the fact that by standard state practice, the speaker does not vote. All present understood that the crucial number was 75. The earlier assembly vote had given them 73, almost enough, 2 votes short. The ensuing week's urgent last-minute lobbying had pushed a few votes this way and a few votes that way. And now, in the assembly chamber, an extraordinary thing was about to happen. A thing that began in such confusion that at first only a few people saw and sucked in their breaths, and the television cameras swiveled and bumped into each other on the assembly floor. It was late in the afternoon. The speeches had exhausted themselves. The clerk began once more his slow tabulation, eyes down one column, nose down the other. One by one, the assemblymen cast their votes, pronouncing the word aloud into their microphones, as is the custom in closed votes or in matters of intense public interest. Yes, no, no, yes. The roll clerk added up, and Constance Cook added up. The newsmen and the secretaries and the legislative aides and the women in the galleries all added up. The roll clerk stood and prepared to announce that the yea votes added up to 74. The abortion bill had failed again, this time by the margin of a single vote. Then, out in the chamber, on the Democratic side of the floor, directly across from the Republican desk of Constance Cook, a lone assemblyman rose from his chair. He stood up very straight, and although the news accounts reported that his hands were trembling and his face was drained of color, it seemed to Cook that he kept his voice steady as he called for the floor. What he said at first was lost in the melee in the chamber and the sudden scramble of the cameras, but the critical words of Assemblyman George Michaels appeared the next morning in the pages of nearly every newspaper in New York, along with the photograph of his graying head bent down toward his desk, after he had begun to cry. Twice so far, he had voted against the abortion bill, Michael said, and his family was assailing him for it. My own son called me a whore for voting against this bill, Michael said, and the people who were present to hear it remember that this was when his voice began to break. I realize, Mr. Speaker, that I am terminating my political career, Michael said, but cannot in good conscience sit here and allow my vote to be the one that defeats this bill. I ask that my vote be changed from no to yes. In the furor that erupted around the desk of George Michaels, the legislative aides weeping, and the Naral people embracing, and the assemblymen shouting at Michaels and thumping him on the back in congratulations, Constance Cook watched from across the chamber and knew that what he said was true. Michaels' district was just north of hers. In upstate New York, a traditionally Republican area, that Michaels had landed largely by pulling support from the city of Auburn's Democrats, many of whom were Roman Catholic. As a Democrat amid Republicans, Michaels had nobody if he lost the Catholic. His own family was Jewish, a point he managed to stress there on the assembly floor. I can't go back to a family seder and say that I defeated the bill, Michael said, referring to the ceremonial Jewish meal held during the spring holiday of Passover. Cook had known before the vote that Michaels intended to switch if a single vote proved to be all she needed. He had promised it to her, she says, and yet it never occurred to her to doubt Michaels' promise. But she understood at once that what he was promising was political suicide for the sake of the biggest abortion bill in the United States. I was deeply grateful, recalls Constance Cook, and as far as I was concerned, it was worth it. On April 11, 1970, in his office at the State House in Albany, Governor Nelson Rockefeller signed into law Chapter 127 of the laws of 1970, adding to the New York Penal Code the following passage: Justifiable Abortion Act. An abortional act is justifiable when committed upon a female with her consent by a duly licensed physician acting A, under the reasonable belief that such is necessary to preserve her life, or within 24 weeks from the commencement of her pregnancy. A pregnant female's commission of an abortional act upon herself is justifiable when she acts on the advice of a duly licensed physician that such act is necessary to preserve her life or within 24 weeks from the commencement of her pregnancy. A brief New York Dateline Wire Service article appeared that same afternoon in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Many more immediately eye-catching stories ran that day in the newspaper. Apollo 13 was preparing to lift off from Cape Canaveral, carrying 3 astronauts towards the moon. The Cardinals had opened baseball season the night before by beating the New York Mets 7-3 before a record first-day crowd at Bush Memorial Stadium. President Nixon was reported to be considering for the U.S. Supreme Court a 61-year-old 8th Circuit Court of Appeals judge named Harry A. Blackmun. But Judy Whitcomb read the Post-Dispatch's New York story first. New York, April 11th. Liberalized abortion laws were on their way today to the desks of New York Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller and Alaska Governor Keith Miller. Rockefeller was in New York City last night when the measure received final legislative approval, 31-26, in the Senate. The governor said he would return to Albany today to sign the measure. The New York law will take effect July 1. Unlike liberalized abortion laws in other states, the law does not require a woman to be a resident of New York State, nor does the operation have to be performed in a hospital. After 24 weeks of pregnancy, abortion could be performed only to save the mother's life. There was a small photograph of George Michaels, his eyes downcast, his shoulders slumped, one hand clasped to his forehead. Changed vote, the caption read, and below. He changes his vote to yes, brings passage of New York's abortion law. And Judy Whitcomb began calling airline companies to get the fares and daily flight schedules from St. Louis to New York. Chapter 4, The Writing in the Heart, 1971. After he spoke before civic groups, or argued on stage in campus abortion debates, or showed a small collection of slides in darkened auditoriums, the mail cheered Matt Backer and warmly urged him on. Dear Dr. Backer, I'm writing this short letter to tell you how good it is to know someone like you is fighting against the upcoming abortion law in Missouri. How anyone can rationalize the killing of an embryo or fetus, I'll never understand. Dear Dr. Backer, we would like to express our agreement with you on the stand that you have taken in regard to the unborn fetus and praise your involvement. We do not feel that society should condone abortion by liberalizing abortion laws. We hold the belief that the society does have an obligation to protect the rights of its citizens, the right to live being one of those. Our support is with you. Dear Dr. Backer, as one of your patients, I feel I must congratulate and commend you on your firm stand against legalized abortion in Missouri. In our highly technological society, where the process of dehumanization often takes place, it is really great to know that there are men like yourself who still care about life and human dignity. You are speaking on behalf of the vast public who still feels the same way you do and supports you wholeheartedly. Thank you for being that kind of man and doctor who still believes in the sacred moral code of life, which still dwells in the minds of many. Good luck. Dear Dr. Backer, may God be with you in your fight for the unborn children. He kept the letters, sliding them into a manila folder with the clippings and photographs people had sent him. Enclosed is a picture of your son, as St. Louis wrote. He was born June 26, 1954, after 26 weeks pregnancy. The son was smiling, his shaggy hair combed artlessly sideways for the picture, and his jacket bore the logo of the best Catholic high school in the city, St. Louis University High, where Backer himself had gone to school. If the woman had counted her pregnancy dates correctly, her son had been born 2 weeks after what the state of New York now defined as the cutoff for elective abortion. Up to 24 weeks of pregnancy under the terms of the astonishing legislation Governor Rockefeller had signed into law, a woman could legally report to a New York hospital and have her baby aborted. The imagery was so vivid, the preemie nurses in one hospital and the second trimester abortionists in another, that Backer's correspondents evidently felt no need to describe it. She and her husband, she wrote, simply wanted the same. Backer paperclipped the picture to the handwritten note and stored it carefully, as though archiving small bits of evidence. He was glad that the lady had written, but he was infinitely sorry that he and Dennis Kavanaugh had been right. It was not tragic cases only the abortion people were after. It was abortion without justification, abortion on demand, abortion for any woman who did not want to give birth to the baby she was carrying. The New York law had not even included even the usual half-hearted language about protecting women's mental or physical health. The only prerequisite to a New York abortion appeared to Matt Backer to be cash up front, and there was plainly quite a lot of that to be had. The January 1971 Medical Economics, in a lengthy article entitled "The Mad Scramble for Abortion Money," told story after story of the sudden entrepreneurial fervor of New York businessmen, doctors, and for-profit referral agencies. Real estate agents were scouting vacant medical suites as potential clinic sites. Abortion facilities were offering over-the-counter stocks for investment purposes. The Clergy Consultation Service had set up its own New York City abortion clinic called Women's Services. Within months of opening in 1970, it was taking in 100 women a day and paying its physicians $75 for abortion, which means that a swift and efficient doctor could make $1,000 during a single 8-hour shift. And the women were traveling to New York by airplane, by train, by automobile, by Greyhound bus. The trip from St. Louis took 24 hours by bus, crossing 5 states, but Backer had no doubt that Missouri women were making it. Every record-keeping effort by the New York health authorities indicated that the legislature in Albany, as both supporters and opponents of the new abortion law had predicted, had succeeded with its April vote in legalizing abortion far beyond the borders of the state of New York. The new law went into effect on July 1, 1970, and over the course of the following year, more than half the abortion patients in the city of New York were identifying themselves as residents of another state. 55,347 residents to 83,975 non-residents, according to City Health Department surveys. The competition for those abortion patients was inventive and fierce. Taxi drivers under kickback arrangements worked the airport and the train stations, trolling for anxious young women who might, without much protest, be deposited at the wrong clinic. Newspaper advertisements and direct mail solicitations to physicians spread the telephone numbers of agencies that could charge $100 simply to act as intermediaries for women who wanted New York abortions. An Ohio businessman set up an enterprise called Aeromed, which promised to use light planes to fly women round trip from Cincinnati to an abortion clinic in western New York. One hired airplane, its banner announcing the number of a private referral agency, startled December vacationers by buzzing Miami Beach. New York was not the only option either. Backer's newspapers and medical newsletters had begun to carry unsettling reports from other parts of the country. In Washington, D.C., where a federal court ruling in 1969 had overturned the conviction of an abortion doctor by finding the District of Columbia's abortion law unconstitutional, a new clinic called Preterm was preparing to accept any patient who could manage the trip to Washington. The California screening process, according to which mental health abortions were supposed to be approved only after 2 doctors' psychiatric review, had been stripped to a formality that appeared to accommodate nearly anybody who had enough money for the abortion. Alaska, Hawaii, and Washington State now offered abortion on demand to in-state residents, and even those residency requirements proved somewhat flexible in practice. In Hawaii, for example, a woman seeking a hospital abortion had only to sign a piece of paper promising that she had lived within the state for the 30 days before she intended to abort. Even the good Midwestern state of Kansas, up against Missouri's western border, was relaxing its abortion barriers by the spring of 1971. At the Kansas University Medical Center, a 5-minute drive across the state line from the Missouri side of Kansas City, a woman could obtain an abortion if the doctors in charge decided that her case suited the state's new model penal code categories. Up and down both coasts, with tentative forays into the heartland, a kind of sickness was encircling the United States, And sometimes it bewildered Becker to think that he had to do this in the first place, that he was actually being called upon to go into public auditoriums and explain why it was a bad idea to permit the legal killing of the unborn. It was as though someone had pulled him aside one day and said, "Remember how it used to be illegal to murder somebody else? We're rethinking that concept. Perhaps you have something to say on the subject." In his basement study, where Becker kept his books and his journals and his chronicles of the battles around the states, the abortion files grew. Lineker Quarterly, the medical ethics journal of the National Federation of Catholic Physicians Guilds, ran regular voluminous essays by physicians and clergy. Proposed abortion laws. Slaughter of the innocents. Who speaks for the fetus? The physician and the rights of the unborn. Man plays God. A Georgetown University philosophy professor named Germaine Grisey wrote a scholarly book, 500 pages long, using Christian doctrine, legal history, and philosophical argument to attack point by point every justification for legalized abortion. A new name is needed for prejudice against the unborn, Grisey wrote at the conclusion of Abortion, the Myths, the Realities, and the Arguments. I suggest it be called prenatalism, since it is based on the fact that we are already born, while they are unborn. Becker took some from one article, some from another, calling for his talks. Here was a careful look at abortion in Japan. Here, an editorial reminding people that what the Nazi doctors had done. Here, a dissection of therapeutic abortions, which were hardly ever truly mandated by medical necessity. Here was a psychiatrist explaining that every depressed pregnant woman faces challenges to her mental health, and that the physician's duty is to help such patients manage their feelings without destroying another human life. And here was a critical review of the post-liberalization situation in New York. The public health officials might be crowing over low complication rates, but they maintain dubious follow-up on out-of-state patients. And in any case, they always fail to point out that every successful abortion produced at least one death. Becker made lists of his discussion points. He typed them in outline form for his slide presentation. Heading: Unborn have legal rights. Bullet points: to recover for prenatal damage, to inherit, to due process, not to be killed by unconstitutional authority. Heading: modern history. Bullet points: social pressures, medical controversy, ALI model penal code, rubella epidemic, group pressures. He made a slide of a magazine cartoon to stir up his audiences a little, especially the Catholics. Husband saying to pregnant wife as they stroll down the sidewalk with their 9 children, "Notice that people don't smile at us the way they used to?" And he selected, with some uneasiness, his abortion pictures. For Matt Becker understood this, just as every regular voice on the new American Right to Life circuit was beginning to understand it. If you could bury your audience in history, you could repeat fact after fact of medical science and biology, you could appeal to moral reason until your breath gave out, but nothing you could say in any public forum had the right to the power of pictures. In later years, a line would emerge among Right to Life speakers, passed along with amusement and the conviction that it was true. The pro-abortion people had 3 rules for debate, it was said, and they went like this. Rule number 1, don't let them show pictures. Rule number 2, don't let them show pictures. Rule number 3, don't let them show pictures. For the men and the women who showed them, usually as a slow-building climax to their urgent appeals in living rooms or church meeting halls or Catholic school auditoriums, the pictures did a single, terrible, unimpeachable thing. They made people see. The abortion law repeal activists could dodge and feint with their talk about zygotes and fetal tissue and reproductive rights, but the pictures showed legs. The pictures showed feet with the toes all formed, miniature toes, the size that entrances adults when they look at a newborn baby. The pictures showed small fingers, stretched and separate as if just learning to flex. The pictures showed crooked elbows and bent knees and tiny rounded heels, but all of these were in pieces, literal pieces, with jagged ground meat colored flesh where the joints should have been. Sometimes the pictures were tumbled and still bloody, the way they looked when they were first dumped into a surgical pan, and sometimes they were laid out more neatly for the pictures, as though some laboratory technician was lining them up to see what might still be missing. A spine, perhaps, or a severed right arm. The first abortion pictures had surfaced during the very early years of the legislative wars. Right to Life from Southern California had a few during the late 1960s, and New York Right to Life distributed pictures in the State House during the last urgent weeks of the campaign to keep the state's old criminal abortion laws intact. But by 1971, 3 years into the legislative wars, the chief national stewardship of the abortion pictures was being ceded to a Cincinnati couple named John and Barbara Wilk. The Wilks were lecturers, as their biographical handouts put it. He was a physician and she was a nurse, and during the 1960s, they had developed what they liked to think of as a sensible Christian morals to the real world roadshow to talk about sexual behavior and individual responsibility. Both Wilks were Catholic, but they tailored their talks for the more general religious audiences, and in the conservative circles in which they tended to travel, church meeting halls and parochial schools were often the sites of their lectures. The Wilks perceived that they raised a few eyebrows when they insisted that married men and women ought to enjoy sex as a God-given expression of intimacy and revel in pleasing each other in bed. But they were no advocates of the sexual experimentation that had attracted such attention during the late 1960s either. Their lectures explained that premarital sex was always wrong, and that teaching young people about contraception made roughly as much sense as showing driver's education students how to break the law without getting caught. The remarks of a colleague, as the Wilks would tell the story later, had prodded them to add abortion to their lecture agenda. He said, "What are you doing on Right to Life?" John Wilk recalls. And we said, "We aren't going to get involved in that. If we do, it'll swallow us up." And it did.